guys. Sorry about that. I think we might be in order. So hopefully you guys will be seeing this. For some reason, there was a static image. You should probably be seeing maybe a second there, a purple screen. So I think we'll be back in order. We're back in shape. The thing I wanted to bring up to start this off correctly was going to be just a nice little simple slide. So it should be just like this. Hopefully this is getting adjusted. So hopefully things are a little bit better. Just did a quick little restart. Always fun in the tech world, right? So sorry for the delay. But Data Factory, it's what we're here for. It's what we're going to be covering. As I mentioned, it's going to be pretty quick, pretty fast. But this will all be uploaded for you to review later. And we might be updating those downloaded files to better assist you to go through this, because you need multiple resources in order to actually get through this, right? So we're going to see that we're going to have a resource group, we're going to have a storage account. It's actually going to be an Azure SQL Server with a database in there, and naturally, of course, an Azure Data Factory. So a lot of different moving pieces, which I've already pre-provisioned, but we're going to talk about it. We're going to go through it so you're aware of it. And if you are watching this as a recording, you should be able to create these resources. Now, just in case, right? Azure is always reinventing the wheel, always reinventing itself. So it, you know, buttons might get moved, buttons might get changed, but that's why every so often we do these along with the nerds, so we can have those updated items. So that's what we're going to check and see. So just in case, as far as an agenda goes for the event, we're going to be talking about just in general, what is Azure Data Factory? We're going to talk about kind of the hierarchy of resources, integration runtimes, like services, datasets, Dataflows. And then, of course, at the end, if we have time, there's like a little extra point here that talks about Synapse pipelines and Dataflows. So that's what we're going to be kind of getting into, and that's what we're going to be exploring. As far as the itinerary for what today looks like, we'll probably move through. We do have technically a scheduled break here at 12:25, just in case any times I mention are going to be based off of East Coast. So 12:25 will be that time frame. We'll take a small little 15-minute break, and then we're going to continue beyond it. As mentioned, after this class is over, we're going to get this kind of encoded, and then it's going to be available to be viewing on demand. So that'll be there. I do have my commander-in-chief here in the background, my partner in crime, if you will, Mitchell Pearson. He's monitoring the chat. So if you guys want to give a quick hello and a what's up to Mitchell Pearson, he's there. He's going to be watching for questions, answering what he can. And then as well, of course, he'll pop a couple questions my way, maybe on the break, that we can answer those. And also, if you want, we have Devin Knight. His birthday is tomorrow, if you want to wish him a happy birthday, guys. So a lot of different things on the menu that we're going to be getting through, that we're going to be covering. So hopefully we can get started, all right? So Azure Data Factory, right? This is effectively going to be a resource that we can provision inside of the Azure portal itself that will give us the capability, of course, of creating pipelines, data flows, all along the time. We have to use some resources like integration, runtimes, and link services, which is what we're going to learn about. But this is going to give us the ability to tap into some features like pipelines is commonly known to give us the ability to do orchestration, integration with many other applications, and also data movement. While Dataflows is going to give us a more traditional cloud-native ETL process, an extract, transform, and load process, where we can connect with sources. So that's what, extract. Then you can make some transformations, the T for transform, and then you can load it into a destination, right? The L. So we have the capability of accessing both those pipelines and data flows in an Azure Data Factory instance. So you actually have to provision this. So just in case, if you're following it, of course, you do need to have an Azure subscription. Generally, you need to have a form of a role. You can see a couple of roles listed here in order to be able to create resources within that Azure account itself. You could do a trial account, which gives like $200 and 30 days of full access. But in some way, shape, or form, to be able to do this stuff, you got to be able to create resources, right? Of course, the approach for us in creating these resources is going to be through the lens of demonstration purposes. So we are going to kind of create, let's say, like our SQL Server. It's going to be set us. We're going to create it. So we'll by default be the administrators. And in our case, I'm going to go ahead and open up the firewall rule just for me. So the idea is, if you're following and training along, definitely we're just going to set this up for working with Azure Data Factory for the scope of this class. But don't forget, if you want to get deeper into things like knowing more about, let's say, storage accounts or Azure SQL Server, make sure you check out in the YouTube. We have an older video from Mitchell Pearson called Azure Data Services, which does focus on those elements, so you can go a little bit more in depth. But we should have some of these topics as well in the future, so keep your eyes out, guys. So to start with, what's a resource group? It's just an organizational container. For those of you new to Azure, you need to have a resource group in order to basically store any service whatsoever. It kind of starts with a resource group. There's technically one parent resource above this, and that would be a subscription. Everything that you create and do is tied to a subscription, which is effectively an organizational container for billing. While the resource group is effectively an organizational container for services. So generally, if you're going to be working with an end-to-end project, you're going to keep all the assets, all the different pieces of that end-to-end project in one resource group. It makes it simple and easy so you can update and set state policies across the entirety of the resource groups, which will traverse all the objects. You can create some permissions related stuff that'll trickle down from a hierarchy perspective to those objects. It just allows you to update, maintain, keep, move all the assets of an end-to-end project inside of a resource group. So you do want to keep it kind of organized. Of course, from there, we're also going to have a storage account, which is we're going to be using the service known as the blob service. Many of you probably are familiar with the term Azure Data Lake Store, right? So that's actually the storage account we've created. It's just an option. We're going to look at it real quick as we go through the process so you can see what we're discussing. But effectively, we're going to use this blob storage system for hosting and storing various files that we'll be using inside of our demonstrations, whether it be to host a file that we're going to use as a source system, or maybe we're just going to end up writing to a location within that data lake itself. But we have this storage account. We're going to use it for that blob service. For those of you who are newer to using it, you can almost consider that data lake like a root directory. You create multiple containers in there. Those are root directories, and then you store files and folders within there. So that's the idea behind it. Naturally, we're also going to use an Azure SQL database. This will kind of serve as giving us the data lake and a database. So in some way, shape, or form, one of the other can serve as a source and or a destination. So we need that kind of capability for us. Lastly, of course, the whole reason why we're here and what we're going to learn primarily around is going to be the Data Factory. This is, once again, a resource that you individually provision. It has its own kind of governance and access and security. So these are all separate services, which I've already gone through the motions and created. So we're going to look at those very quickly as far as for a setup. Should you want to kind of stand this up for yourself, should you want to follow along, as mentioned, we should have a follow-up to this class. I'm going to probably update that resources folder with an ARM template for you guys. Turning off the camera. Yeah, I'll try that, Mitchell. Good call. See if that helps out with no camera. So let's go through some of these resources that I created, and we'll showcase this really quickly. So I'm going to back out of this, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my browser, right? So I'm going to go over here and log into portal.azure.com. I'm actually just going to bring this up on the screen over here. Right, we have that set. And you can see I already have a resource group here located, which I have all of my resources within. These are what we're going to be using for today. There's effectively nothing really been loaded inside of the actual, the data factory is completely blank, the SQL database is completely blank, but we're going to walk through what these resources would look like. So the resource group, we're not going to go through. It's very basic in the setup. We'll just actually go ahead and showcase first how to create a storage account, which once again has multiple services. The one of which that we're going to focus on is going to be the actual blob service. So you can see right when I go ahead here and I either hit get started, create an item. If you just hit create a resource in the upper left, all of these things will get you to the marketplace. And you can see storage account is visible just here. All right. So when we select that storage account option, you're provided with the capabilities of deciding, okay, I'm going to make a storage account. What subscription should this be under? So you just want to pick the corresponding organizational billing container, and then which resource group do we want to connect this to? Where do we want to place this? Now, if you already have a resource group created, you can see you can choose from those items, or at this juncture, you can actually create a brand new one should you decide to. It is really your choice. You can name it whatever you want. The resource group technically that I'm using is this very one here. It's called it Azure Data Factory - Learn with the Nerds. And you can see you just kind of go through, give it a name. Everything has its own kind of naming convention here. Definitely kind of keep an eye out. It tells you like, hey, this one has to all be lowercase numbers and letters only, right? There's no special characters. Everything seems to have its own fun naming convention. So you go through and you configure it. I haven't done anything out of the ordinary for this setup except for one item in particular, and that's just simply the Advanced tab. In the Advanced tab, I have gone through and there is a section here for Data Lake Storage Gen 2, and there's just a checkbox. Basically, do you want this storage account to be basically leverage hierarchical namespacing, right? This basically just allows us to work with more traditional big data analytic workloads, but it still kind of maintains a similar idea that we're working in a file storage system, right? You still have a storage account, you still create containers, and within those containers, you do have your respective folders and files. But there is a bit that goes into discussing what is the difference between blob storage, traditional, and what is going to be the difference with ADLS. So definitely something to check out. We have some of those videos and information located on our website, and also the ADS class also goes into that. But this is the only thing that I check marked once I configured it, and I literally went through and hit review and create. So for those of you who are going to watch this after the fact, that's it. Just give a name to the storage account, put it in that resource group that everything else is going to go into, and check mark the enable hierarchical namespace. That's just to more fall in line with what I've done. Is that a requirement? Technically, no, you don't have to, but it's just the route that I went. So once you go through creating that, it's a fairly quick process to create your storage account. The only thing I've done is created a degree of containers. So this is what it would look like with a storage account done and available where you can go and configure. Right? You can go over right here under storage accounts. You can locate the resource group in question. You'll see that I've actually put my resource group right here on my dashboard so I can very easily access it. And when I look at my storage accounts, the only thing that I've gone through, which you can just kind of set this up, is the containers. In the container section here, you simply are just creating effectively I like to consider root directories, right? That is kind of an area where I kind of go and that we're going to be focusing on. So that's what we want to do, and we will then move on from there. You can see I've only created one container called data, and then inside of that, once you're in a container, it's like you're navigating a folder directory, right? You can see I made a folder called source, I made a folder called destination, and we can upload items directly to it, right? If we actually look and examine the resources which can be found in the description from the download, you're going to see that I do have right here under resources just this little kind of item here that we can go ahead and bring into the file. So as the classes go on, we're going to actually go through and upload these respective items into the respective locations as they'll serve as resources for us. So I do believe this one right here, we're going to end up loading into our directory, which, you know what, we can go ahead right now. As you can see right now, class files, resources, demo 2. I'm going to go ahead and kind of locate this, and I'm just going to upload it into my data lake, right? So I'm going to go here, and why not? Right now I'm in my source location. I'm just going to go ahead and hit upload, which all this does is show you a local file directory, right? And there is, just in case real quick, there's a question, does it cost anything to create a resource group? The answer is no there. It's actually a super simple organizational container. There's no cost for the actual resource group, but obviously the services inside of it would carry potential cost. So I'm going to go find that file that we just talked about, right? I'm going to go over here to my desktop. I'm going to find my Azure Data Factory, class files, and I'm going to grab that input EMP. And I'm just going to upload it. Super small file. You can see it's just 52 bytes. Super basic TXT file. There's nothing much going on in here. If we actually click on this, you can look at some of the details and even view it because it's a text delimited file. I can actually see the results in here and make changes if I wanted to. But the moral of the story is I now have a file right here inside of the data lake that I can interact with. It's there, and you can use this for, now it's inside of our Azure environment, inside of the storage account that we can tinker with. So that's one of the items. That is the data lake itself. The other items in question that we'll look through very fast is, of course, an Azure SQL database, and I just went through and developed the most basic SQL database that you can imagine, just hitting create. You can type in SQLDB. You can see there's Azure SQL Database. And this one definitely has more configuration options. Like I said, having the actual ARM template to create all these resources automatically for you will be something that'll be helpful. But you can see it simply says, hey, you want to create an Azure SQL database. Actually, this one is not where exactly I'm wanting. 1 second. SQL database. I think that was a third-party item. So here it is, SQL database. That's what I want to create. Maybe. All right, there we go. So you can see here, it's once again asking those same kind of questions, right? What is my subscription? What is my resource group? So once again, we're kind of keeping everything nice and clean together. We give it a name. You do need to have a server. So the nice part is when creating a database, you can also just create the server. So you can either point to one that exists or nicely create a new one, right? And these are all done with the basic default settings. Because we're not focused on like SQL database and data lake and those things, we're keeping basically all the settings for these resources as standard. The only thing you do want to consider, because this one will have the potential biggest impact on cost, would be the configuration of this database. And for our example, I've actually gone in to configure this, and I've set this to the, I think I'm using the standard S0 provisioning. So you can see it's roughly $14.72 per month. But you could actually go here and use the basic option, which is just $4.90 per month estimated. That would be sufficient for this type of demonstration. So you just go through and, like I said, you configure a SQL database with no information, SQL Server with no details, and that will put you in a spot here where you now have a SQL Server and a SQL database. This will take a couple of more moments to provision than the data lake will, but then you'll end up with this. The only remaining items, once it is provisioned, because I'm going to be using the query editor built into the Azure portal, is that we need to grant us the capability of connecting to this. So in this case, what I do is in the SQL Server itself, there is an area in the settings for this called networking, where you can basically whitelist IP addresses. For the most part, with an Azure SQL database, the server itself is effectively locked down by default with the settings. You just can't access it. So if you go into the network settings for the server, you can actually add your specific local IP address. So you can go in there and just add your IP address so that while you're working through this demonstration, only machines from that IP address can access this. So it's still pretty darn locked down. But yeah, that's the only thing I've done. So a standard data lake, a standard SQL Server, a standard database, and just opening up the firewall to my IP address. Like I said, just wanted to put those basic instructions out there for those who are following along, but in the future you should have a nice, ARM template that'll actually create all these resources for you. You just need to populate the relevant details and information. And then lastly, of course, it's the Data Factory, which I've been seeing some people talking about ADF in there, and someone actually wrote something that's pretty common, right? For Azure Data Factory, right? We go and once again, we look at creating a resource and we can see what the description is here, but there's an interesting one that I already just saw come through in the chat, right? A hybrid integration service here. Someone wrote in the chat SSIS, which is a very similar or popular discussion that people have as to, well, what is ADF? SSIS is Microsoft's on-premises solution for ETL work, extract, transform, and load. So as soon as this was announced, people were like, oh, is this going to be SSIS in the cloud? And it's very much in the V1 version, those who maybe looked at Data Factory way long ago, definitely a little bit different. It really wasn't giving us that SSIS look and feel. But in the Data Factory that we have now that we're going to see and we're going to explore, I feel it very much does give us that similar type of capabilities that we find in integration services. It's just a different designer, right? You have pipelines, which in my opinion relates more to like the control flow in SSIS, and naturally you can kind of guess because of the naming convention. Dataflows works a little bit closer with equivalent to the data flow task in SSIS. So there are some parallels. I saw that right in there. Yeah, I saw that information in there as in the chat. So very good kind of description. I see it used all the time. But like I said, of course, if you're going to be following along with this once we put that recording up, you of course have to create the Data Factory itself, which does have its own process. There's of course many different configuration things that you can set here. As you can see, you start the same as everything else. What is your subscription? What is your resource group? Keeping everything in the same container. And then you just give it the name of your Azure Data Factory instance. There's some additional fun stuff in here that you could get into. Like I said, we've done a default kind of installation here, a provisioning of this, if you will, where we did not kind of set up a CI/CD, so continuous integration, continuous development with Git. You can definitely do this. You can see DevOps or GitHub. You can do that. It's always a great thing for production ready work. But you can say, you know what, I just want to provision Data Factory and I'll set this up later when I want to do it. And there's, of course, all the standard options you would expect coming from provisioning a Azure resource, where you can kind of configure this to work with a managed virtual network. If you're leveraging that for, just security within your organization, if you have a virtual network in play and you want to put this as part of it, you can enable that here. But the nice part is you can actually do this after the fact as well. So even if there are choices that are made here, you can kind of go through the process and set this up. You can see there's some discussion here about the self-hosted integration runtime. I think I already saw some conversation on that in the chat, but don't worry, we're going to get into integration runtimes here in a moment. So we'll discuss it. But like I said, across the board, if you're going to mimic the environment I have, the only thing I've done is select this git configure, git later, and literally I went and hit create resource. That is what ends up giving me this resource group. And we have lots of items in here, right? I already showed my data lake off. The SQL server's in there. There's really nothing going on. I did add my firewall rule in there. So we're going to get into using that here in a moment as just the relevant resources we can leverage. But there's a lot. There's a lot with Azure Data Factory, and that's what we're going to start focusing on. Now that we've talked about like the layout of the land and what I'm going to be using for this, let's now get into more of the conversation around the Data Factory itself, right? So inside of the tool, and funny enough, if anyone here is maybe been, we had a Synapse Analytics Learn with the Nerds, it's going to feel pretty deja vu-ish here. The UI or the interface design that Synapse Analytics took is from Data Factory. So when we're in there, it feels very deja vu-ish as far as the appearance, how you navigate and all of these items. Unofficially, we basically kind of relate to these as hubs. So when we go here and we launch Data Factory for the first time, which we're going to do just when we're done with these slides, is we start with the home hub, right? You can see just right here on the left-hand side, we actually have some icons. What I can do is I can actually bring that up so we can move between them, right? Here is my Data Factory, right? I'm going to go ahead here and launch it. So this actually launches in its own browser, just like if you were launching the Synapse workspace. Like I said, it's pretty similar. And you're going to see that we have these areas here. So this is what we're kind of referring to, the hubs. This is what you navigate through. This is kind of what you leverage. So that's what we're seeing in this screenshot right here in this PowerPoint. So in this section, you have some actions. The home hub is kind of like any sort of overview basic hub where you have access to do actually a lot. You're going to see your recent resources. You're going to see some wizards, so you can see that ingest option. That's actually a quick access button to launch the copy data activity wizard, which is actually going to be the first pipeline that we're going to create. Orchestrate just brings you to the create pipeline screen from scratch. Transform data opens up a brand new data flow to create from scratch. And then lastly, you do have a configure SSIS runtime, which brings you to the runtime. Basically, it brings you to the manage hub, which we'll get into, so that you can configure a runtime. But we haven't really discussed runtimes. We're going to get into that momentarily. Other stuff that I just didn't include in the screenshot, if you kind of scroll down, you have this Discover More, which is a nice link to various different templates, and it usually brings you to Microsoft documentation. The feature showcase in the resource also brings you to blogs and other types of internal documentation from Microsoft. So the next hub going down the list is the Author Hub, and quite often this is where you do a fair amount of your work, honestly. Once you have certain things set up, as we're going to discuss, there's almost like a hierarchy here that needs to be understood. But in the design area, you have the ability of creating pipelines, creating data sets, creating data flows, and as you can see at the bottom, it's been a little while now, but this used to be another form of a data flow called a wrangling data flow, but it's kind of been more formalized given the name Power Query. So if you remember reading about wrangling, it's been renamed. It's the Power Query editor online. It's something you can leverage alongside of pipelines. So it's pretty interesting. If anyone's coming from maybe Azure Analysis Services or maybe a Power BI background and you're familiar with using Power Query Editor, right? The power of M there. You do have a limited version of this out here. Not every form of the transform. If you were to compare it to like Power BI, let's say, you don't have all of the transformative capabilities here within Data Factory. But it's here. So it's still cool that it's available to us. And like I said, it gives us a different way to transform that maybe you are more familiar with if you're just getting into Data Factory. The monitoring hub, we're just going in line. There's only 4. This is where there's some really nice built-in monitoring, guys. You can literally watch and see as your pipelines are either triggered by schedules, as you're debugging them. Maybe you ran one of your pipelines to check it out and you accidentally closed out of it, so now you can no longer see the outputs of it, and you want to see, well, what was the results of that debugging? It's all here in the monitoring hub, right? You can monitor directly your pipelines, your data flows, your data flow debugs. All the assets in here that could potentially be recorded are available to you, right? So you have this nice and built in at your fingertips. There are ways, of course, that you can even extend the logging even more so, but it's nice knowing that out of the box, you've got some great stuff right here at your fingertips, right? Monitoring, as we go through the class, we'll probably just adventure over to the monitoring hub. And then we're potentially, quite often, where your projects are going to start is here, right? The Manage Hub actually has a couple of critical pieces. We're going to talk to a degree around integration runtimes, because technically when it comes to resources and the hierarchy of them, the integration runtime is kind of at the top, right? This is effectively going to be the item that manages the compute, the resources that are going to be used, kind of processing the execution of your pipelines and your data flows. This is what's going to kind of meter everything and how you're going to be charged. It's through your integration runtime, and you can scale these things up or down. Basically, you can increase the potential of how high it can scale, I guess you can say. By default, when you create your Azure Data Factory, you will get a default Azure integration runtime. More on that here in a moment, but it's there, and technically you're ready to go out of the box. You have your integration runtime, which is step number 1, but you can actually create your own explicit integration runtimes for other needs, quite often workload balancing, right? Not only can you create integration runtimes here, this is also where you will create your link services. More on that in a moment, but effectively these are going to be your connection strings for your data sets. And we'll talk about more about that relationship, but when you create a link service, you basically choose what technology, more formally the term is called which data store you're going to create a link service for, and then you specify which integration runtime you're going to have manage that connection, along with, of course, how are we going to authenticate. So we are going to create a couple of link services. We have that data lake I discussed, and we have that SQL Server, right? These are going to end up being, once again, either source or destination. It really just depends how we define our data sets. But that's going to be one of the biggest things you're going to leverage here is link services and integration runtimes. But as you can see, there are other types of items in here. At the very end of the class, we should talk about triggers. I think in the vast scrolling list that is the chat here, so I love it. I see Mitchell's doing his best here. I saw something about scheduling potentially somewhere in the list, but there are definitely different scheduling options, and that is known as a trigger. Technically, there are ways to kind of kick off or execute your pipelines outside of Azure Data Factory. That's a little more advanced, so we won't be going into it, but I'll probably just discuss it so you're aware of that. Anyone here who maybe is familiar with Logic Apps or Power Automate, it could be a pretty cool way for you to go about it. But there are various different trigger options here that you can leverage. So, basic design, basic layout of just getting it to Azure Data Factory, right? The different hubs and how potentially you will interact with those hubs. We've already briefly discussed integration runtimes, right? Once again, the integration runtime is the compute infrastructure. You hear the term compute a lot when working with Azure. These are effectively the virtual resources that you're going to be leveraging, right? The CPU, the memory, the required resources to basically execute or process some sort of project, some sort of command, some sort of query, right? This is what we're using, and the integration runtime effectively manages that. And it's going to be for either data movement or SSIS package execution, because you have 3 integration runtimes potentially that you can create. So as you can see, the first one, and the one that is built for you by default, is actually the Azure Integration Runtime. This is going to be what you use to effectively natively connect to, your various different items that exist within the public networks, within the clouds, right? So this is how you connect to, AWS, Cassandra, Mongo. If these things are available online in the cloud, you can simply use an Azure Integration Runtime to connect to it. Obviously, this is what you're going to use for anything like specifically Azure, so Data Lake, SQL DB. You can use the Azure Integration Runtime. But as soon as potentially either your source or your destination starts moving towards the direction of leveraging on-premises sources or destinations, let's say I want to pull data from my on-premises SQL Server and I want to move that into files inside of my data lake, that is now when we need to, the answer is yes, you can do this, but you need to create your link service leveraging a self-hosted integration runtime. Now we're going to discuss this and talk about this, but we won't be going through a self-hosted integration runtime, as that actually requires you to download and install an actual self-hosted integration runtime service. So you have to go through the process, install a service locally within that private network that you effectively link to your instance of Azure Data Factory so you can create that bridgeway, that tunnel, if you will, to communicate between private network and public network, right? That is what the self-hosted integration runtime will give you the capabilities, basically to run activities between cloud data stores and data stores in your private network. So really powerful, really cool, especially if you're maybe in a hybrid scenario solution. Self-hosted is definitely super important, right? But like I said, quite often you're going to need to get IT involved or administration, because like I said, you have to get a service installed, generally on some sort of application server that's always on, always running. That's the idea. And then lastly, the SSIS package execution, right? This is the third option. It was actually right there in the home hub, ready to go. There is an increased cost to self-hosted integration runtime. You can actually find the costs of all of this. I can probably, at the break we take around 12:25, what I'll do is I'll get the general documentation around pricing, but generally self-hosted does have an increased cost per DIU per hour. So the cost of running a pipeline is naturally across the amount of effectively DIUs. It's an interesting term, we'll get into that. The amount of DIUs per hour. So that's how it's billed, and there is a higher cost per hour for self-hosted. It's not astronomical, but it is more expensive. So like I said, we won't be actually implementing self-hosted, but we are obviously having that conversation now, and we'll probably go into that a little bit later. But for those hybrid scenarios where you want to take your already existent SSIS packages and you would like to deploy them inside of an actual kind of Azure compute environment, that is what your Azure SSIS integration runtime, that is really its only purpose. You literally will be storing your SSIS packages inside of an SSIS catalog within an Azure compute environment. It's effectively within an Azure SQL database. So that also very niche, very specific, more for hybrid scenarios. We won't be actually deploying and creating that. All right. So IRs, they're actually critical. They're very important. We'll look at them very briefly once we get back to the actual data factory itself, but that's where everything starts once again. Now we do have one ready for us out of the box, but once again, it's not uncommon to explicitly create your own integration runtime for your workload balancing, or if you need to go on-prem, you have to, right? You have to create that self-hosted. So that is where a lot of times the story will begin when you start with Azure Data Factory. Now link services. Once you have an IR, right, now we can create a link service, which once again defines the connection to whatever data store that you want to connect to, right? So if we want to connect to Azure SQL Database, I'd create a link service, I choose that technology or data store, and then I have to configure it. It's going to ask me, okay, well, what's the server? Which one is the database? And how are you going to authenticate, right? So it asks us these items, and that will change naturally depending on what type of data store I choose. That's the options for SQLDB, right? If I were to choose something like Azure Data Lake, obviously it's going to give us the actual storage account name, and then how we want to authenticate to that. If it's Oracle, they're going to give a URL, but everything, it changes based off of your choice of what we want to connect to, right? And these link services, they're reusable assets. When I point to an Azure SQL Server and its respective database, that means that this link service will allow me to point to whatever tables, views, stored procedures, whatever it is in that database. This link service covers that. In more advanced ways, technically you could set it up so you parameterize that, so you could pass through different database names, so you could have one connection to a server and then parameterize the database name. But that's an advanced topic for an advanced day. We'll probably do that in the future there, guys. So I have my connection. I create my link service that goes to, let's say, my Azure SQL database. It's all set, it's in place, good to go. Then what we say is, now I want to create my data set. I know I have a connection to my Azure SQL Server and this database. The data set would effectively be the table, view, or stored procedure that I'm interested in. That's the relationship between data set and link service. If the link service is pointing to my data lake, then my data set would be either the file or the folder that I'm interested in, right? So that's how all three of these technologies come together. Link service, or pardon me, integration runtime, link service, and then the data set. That's kind of the order of operations, if you will. Small subnotes as we're going through these. I'm not going to really take advantage of it, but quite often you're going to have an Azure Data Factory instance. Possibly multiple users will be part of it. You can create folders for grouping purposes. This is in the datasets, pipelines, Dataflows. You can create folders and group them organically, however you see fit. So I'm not going to use it, but it's a simple thing that should be kind of made present. So we're going to go here and now create a couple of link services, and we're going to be pointing to our Azure SQL database that I created, and we're going to create a link service to the data lake account that I've also created. So once again, this is generally where this is going to start. And when we go here, I think some of you will get some of your answers question as to, well, what can I connect to, right? So I think we're going to see some fun answers to this one right here. So let me go ahead and bring this up. We're inside of Data Factory. We need to head over to the Manage Hub. Choop. And we're already here in the link service. Once again, small reminder, there's already an integration runtime here. You can see it's the default one, it's present, but you do have the capability of creating additional integration runtimes. When we create this link service, it is going to ask you what integration runtime do you want to connect with. And you can see once we go through this process that you can go ahead and configure this and change out exactly what we want to do. Is it general purpose, memory optimized, how many cores are we going to have? This is the control cores, and then you have workers. So you can see you have 16 driver cores and 64 workers. This will, of course, increase. You're choosing at what level this can scale to. So obviously that will produce and have a higher cost. If you're letting it scale higher, if you do this automatically, and you have to remember, right, if it's using 4 DIUs, if it's using 4 of these cores and it takes an hour to execute that, and you use 8 cores but it only takes 30 minutes to execute, the overall price is effectively going to remain the same. So there's always a very careful balance of trying to figure out, how much do I want to scale it? There's kind of a wall of diminishing returns here that potentially you could just be scaling it up and up and up, but it's not going any quicker. So you are effectively just putting a little more money into that execution, and it's really not a big impact. But we're going to take advantage of this default integration runtime, and we are going to create some link services, right? And the first one that we're going to go through and create is, let's create one to our SQL Server, right? And you can see as soon as I hit new, there's a lot of stuff in here. I've been seeing people ask questions. I think I saw something about, hey, can we connect to Amazon Web Services? You can see there's RDS for SQL Server, RDS for Oracle, Amazon S3, it's compatible. I mean, if you're here, if you actually are in Azure Data Factory, or if you're rewatching this and going through it, just scroll through the list. There is a pretty large list here, and this continues to grow. We can see a couple are in preview mode, and they'll eventually become GA, QuickBooks preview. There's a bunch of stuff going on in here, and they're adding connections all the time, right? So definitely something to observe, because today there may not be a connection for you that works, but tomorrow there might be. There is a lot going on in this list of data stores, right? So for us, it's all about trying to figure out exactly what do we want to connect to. So in my case, I want to do Azure SQL Database, so I can just start to type in SQL, and that's usually sufficient. There's a whole section for Azure, but in here I can see there's Azure SQL Database right there. And I'm going to go ahead and select this and hit continue. And then we are simply asked a couple of things. Once again, this screen is going to be specific to our choice. So in my case, I'm going to use a simple little naming convention where I use, it's an Azure resource, because as we saw, we could be connected to Amazon, Cassandra, DB, right? This is an Azure resource. Specifically, it's going to be a SQL database. And then usually I will put the name of the actual SQL server here, or actually the name of the database itself. So if I revisit my resources over here, we can see that my SQL database name is right here, ADF LWTN database. Or I can just put the name of the server, this little guy here. It's really your choice, right? We need to easily be able to identify what is this pointing to. So if I do an ADF, learn with the nerds, I think I have it here, what was it, server? So you do something like that, something that's present and visible so you can see, oh, from a glance, I know exactly what this link service is pointing to. Naming conventions can obviously change and modify over time. You also got to follow the appropriate naming conventions. Got to keep that underscores going. But you'll find your own kind of naming convention to make it as easy and straightforward to, to recognize. You can add a little description if you want to, and as I mentioned, you choose which integration runtime you're going to have manage this. We have our one option here, so that is what we're going to stick to. And then it's basically choosing what we want to connect, how we want to connect, pardon me. And I'm going to go ahead and just go with an enter manually, right? I'm going to go over here and find my server. So you can see there's my SQL server, and there is the server name, right? That's all it's asking for. Copy this server name. And I put that in there. And the authentication that I'm going to do, and also what's our database name? I think it's just this little guy right there. I'm going to copy that. And once again, there are ways to technically parameterize this. We'll get into the expression language here in a moment, but you see it's actually giving me the option to do that. But here, this is going to be a connection that points to this server, specifically this database. And then we have to specify how we want to authenticate. There are many options here, quite often by kind of from a production perspective. Using the actual managed identity options is a very popular object. In that case, we would actually have to take the time to look for this application. It has its own kind of application ID, and we need to assign that managed identity access into this actual SQL server. So it would have its own process where we would have to make sure that's taken care of, but then we could use that option and we effectively authenticate this entire Azure Data Factory to be able to access that SQL server and or data lake. So the managed identity option is definitely a very popular one. Now, as part of my SQL Server creation, I created a general kind of SQL admin account. So you can see right here, just admin user. So I'm actually going to stick to just using a basic SQL authentication type, and I just need to provide the respective information. You can see also it's promoting, make sure I type that correctly. It's also promoting the usage of Azure Key Vault here, so that is an option that we can use. Make sure I've got that. Oops. Actually, now that I think about it, I might have to switch my firewall here. Let's see if that's the rule. Let's see if that's what they're saying, or if I just fat-fingered that. Let's take a look. This is good. Yeah, so funny enough, one of the things we changed was I hardwired in, right? So I need to actually go over here to networking, and more than likely, it looks like it's the same, but just in case, I'm gonna add that into the mix. I've got that set. I've got this server. All right. Let's make sure I'm using the right admin user. And let's try that again. When you're typing on a new keyboard, it can be a little funky. So just went in there, kind of updated the firewall rules so we can get that set. As you can see, like I said, with SQL Server, it's locked down by default. You have to go through the effort to make it accessible. But now I have a connection that's going to be managed by this integration runtime that I can use with datasets. Now I have a way to point to this database and really connect to whatever tables, stored procedures, views, whatever's in here. This link service is going to give me that capability of connecting to it, right? Once again, have to have the link service or you're going to stop. When we get to datasets, the first thing it's going to say is, okay, well, what kind of dataset do you want to create? We choose SQLDB. It says, all right, choose one of the compatible link services that you have, or you need to create one. Now we have this, anything we're going to do with the server, boom, it's right there. But we also want to connect to our data lake, right? We want to connect there. So what I can do is I can create another link service, and these are what we're going to use for the rest of the day, and I can just search data lake. Here we go. We know we created the Azure Data Lake storage. We give it a name, similar convention. It's an Azure resource, ADLS, and then this is where you possibly would create and give the name of the storage account itself. So maybe this little guy here, right? Some indication visibly of what storage account am I connecting to. So I've got this set, And once again, which integration runtime we're going to use, we'll stick to the default. And then we must choose, well, which actual storage account do we want to point to. So I'm going to choose my subscription and choose that very same data, the data lake that we put up there. So this ADF, Learn with the Nerds SA is what I named it. You can see it's just right there. Just in case, let's test that connection. It's using the account key. So now we have a connection to this data lake, and pretty much whatever containers I end up creating, whatever folders I have, I'll be able to navigate through those directories and pull back whatever folder files that I want. I can write into this directory. We can create new tables in the SQL database. These are what we're going to use for our pipelines. Got to start with the linked services. Right? That is critical. It's essential. And like I said, everyone here is going to be there, regardless of what you're trying to look at and connect to. This is what you're going to lean into. And if you're more interested, let's say like the data flow of things, when we get to the data flows, you're going to see that there aren't as many connection options when we talk about the data flow itself. So there's far more connectivity there in regards to just kind of Azure native. You can't connect to Amazon S3, Dataverse. They've been adding more and more, but it's about 20% of what you have available with pipelines. So a lot of times, let's not forget, pipelines are going to be your orchestration and your data movement tools. This is probably going to be your go-to for connecting to external sources to bring that data into some sort of Azure kind of storage element, whether that's a data lake, SQL database, SQL pool, whatever it is, because once you've made that movement, and this is generally referred to as possibly like an ELT. Remember we talked about ETL? This is going to be more like an ELT operation, where you use that pipeline to just take the data from Oracle, let's just say, you moved it into files inside of your data lake, and now you can connect to that with your data flows and do whatever transforms you're interested in doing and writing that to whatever maybe final destination table. Maybe that's your SQL database, right? So hopefully that's starting to paint the picture of how these different things are going to fit together, right? That's how I related the SSIS control flow to pipelines and the data flow task to the data flows here. They work seamlessly together, and they're really meant to be. And you'll see that way more once we get into things like, well, how do I run my data flow? It's going to be through pipelines, right? So we've got our linked services there. We've talked about the integration runtime. I'm going to head over to the author area here, because in a moment, we're actually going to walk through doing our very first pipeline, but we are going to use the wizard to be our first experience. And the wizard's kind of nice. The wizard technically could help us and allow us to create a link service from there and a data set, but we created our link services ahead of time. It's always good. I always like to create these objects ahead of time and then leverage them within the pipeline and data flows. But technically you could create it, and you'll see that when we go into this process. So just a couple of items on what we're going to start with. The copy activity wizard. This is a very common utilized transform or technically activity within pipelines, and it serves a very, very simple purpose. The copy activity wizard is literally a source and a destination. That's it. And just in case I keep using the term destination, what you're going to see here in a moment, I don't see it in the screenshots. I actually have destination written here. I think the wizard shows destination, but the term that is used that you will find in these activities and the data flows is actually the term sink, S-I-N-K. So if you hear me say destination, quite often that's just habitual. It's synonymous with sink, right? It's the destination. You can see it's even in this slide here. But we're going to see that. We're going to set up. There's a really cool wizard. There is an option for SharePoint, John. You can go from, there's, like I said, if you go into that data store, that's a pretty massive scrolling list. There's a lot of options. But we're going to go through, right? We're going to check it out. We're going to walk through this wizard, which is going to start off with, what do you want to call this? What's your source? What's your destination? It creates whatever you did. Let's assume we hadn't created links. It would create 2 link services, or depending on what you're pointing to, could be 1. But it'll create your link services, your data sets. It'll create the new pipeline, and it'll have the activity already configured. And it's a wizard, right? It kind of walks you through, as you can see, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and it creates this for us, which is pretty awesome. And you can see, obviously, a couple choices. Hey, do you just want to run this once whenever the wizard's done? Do you want to create a schedule? There's a reference for a tumbling window, which is effectively something that you can schedule within an actual single day, but you do it at the minute or hour intervals. And it can be something that you can do for if there's an issue or something fails, you can kind of revert and pick up from that piece. So it's interesting. But there's choices. As in a wizard, you move through various choices and you have to make those decisions. right? So these are just what you would find in the wizard itself. Best way to get through this is actually to showcase the copy activity wizard. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and, we're going to create a table that has information in it in our SQL database. And we're going to take that information from the SQL database and write it into a file inside of the data lake. So that is going to be the direction we'll be going for this example. So for this, you're going to see that I've kind of, in the resources folder, let me bring that up here. I have just a simple script. If we open this up, want to open up on this. It's a very basic SQL script. There's a couple of ways we can go about approaching this. You can either open something up like SQL Server Management Studios and connect to it, but I'm actually going to take advantage of a built-in capability right here within the Azure portal, which is fun. You know, SQL Server Management Studios would perfectly work for this, but I'm going to find my database, right? I'm going to right click, and I like to kind of have a tab open for it. So this will be where I have my database, and I have this link, so if I want to go to any other resource I can. But basically what I want to do for this database is to connect to it, right? Connect to this database so I can run scripts against it. And one of the ways we can do this is right here in this query editor, which is pretty fun. You just have to provide an account that has access to this. As long as I typed it right, there we go. And we can see as of right now, there's nothing in here. No tables, no views, no stored procedures, nothing. So it's pretty blank, but you can just straight up write SQL queries in here, select statements. You can add, as you can see, create statements, alter statements. So we can do all of that. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and hit open query. I'm going to find that very file that we were just talking about, right, in demo 1, and it just loads in a create table statement. You can see, boom, right there, create DBO EMP. It's 3 columns. The first one's going to be an identity column, so we don't need to input values. It's just going to start with 1 and increment by 1. And then we're just going to insert 2 records, John and Jane Doe. That's it, first and last name. 3 columns, 2 rows, super simple stuff. It's all about the process, not necessarily the data we have in here, but we'll be working with other data elements in a little bit. But I'm going to run this. We're going to see that, boom, it's successful. If I refresh this, I now have a table with 2 records in it, right? Nothing crazy, nothing fancy, but we have now something inside of our Azure SQL DB that we can query. And this is going to allow us to do the copy activity wizard. So I've got this here. The idea is let's just take the contents of this table and put it into a delimited text file somewhere in my data lake. And to be honest, if we go into the data lake, if you remember the structure I created, we have our data container and there's this destination folder. I'm just going to drop it right here. That's what we're going to end up doing. So I'll leave this here because technically when it's all said and done, I should just be able to hit refresh and voila. We're going to have a text file that has the contents of that table. So let me return back to Data Factory. You technically can access the wizard from here as well. You notice if you hit the plus sign here and you go to pipeline, right at the bottom, the copy data tool, this is effectively the wizard. But let's not forget, also in the home ribbon, there was this whole, hey, ingest. And these both options will take you to the same screen. So right off the bat, you simply, do you want to go ahead and just create a pipeline using one of the built-in copy tests? It's very simple, straightforward. You have lots of connections. You're talking about 90 plus data sources. That's what we saw when we hit add link service. Remember that scrolling list? This is what it's referring to. There's another direction you can go here where you can actually create a parameterized pipeline, but you would have to have an actual control table which contains the basically table names that you want to create. We're actually going to talk about a control table later. It's one of the examples. We're going to go through that. So I saw a quick question in there. Can you read from ADL Gen 2 in SSMS? There are ways that you can use an actual Azure Storage Explorer experience in SQL Server Management Studios. And technically speaking, depending on what you're connecting to, you can use what's called Polybase to query items in the data lake. Little off topic, we aren't going to cover that in here, but the answer in short, Robert, is yes, you can query files in the data lake from something like SSMS. So I'm going to use this built-in copy. How do you want to run this? We'll just run it once right here. We don't need to put this one on the schedule. We'll talk about that later. So then it says, okay, next is source. What is your source? And you can see if you choose one of these options up top, it's effectively just filtering what your drop-down list has here. If you don't choose anything at the top, you actually get to see all of your link services. So you can see I see both my actual data lake. Oops, the zoom there didn't work too well. 1 second. All right, so you can see there's icons here that shows that first one, and my naming convention really helps out here. I can see the top one is my SQL database and the bottom one is my data lake. So in this case, we decided my source is going to be the database. So this is just the connection, our link service. Now it says, all right. We need to create a data set. So what it's actually done is given me a little UI of all the available tables in here. If you had views you wanted to look at, just check the box and the list will be populated by views as well. We only have the one table in here, so this actually makes life pretty easy. I can just hit DBO EMP. If you want to, technically you can preview this real quick, see what's going on in there. But this is what I want to connect to. This is the data set that I want to derive using this linked service. So that's our source. It says, okay. Also you can preview this if you want to do some isolation stuff, but we're not going to do anything in this realm. We're just going to say, that's my source. What's my destination? And we already decided that we're going to go in and use the data lake as our destination. So we're going to go ahead and set this. Once again, you can filter it down if you want. We know though, we want to use the data lake option. It's very nicely labeled here, so we can just choose it. And then it says, all right, where exactly do you want to go ahead and write this to, right? So the nice part is there's a nice built-in little browse here, right? And I'm literally now navigating through my data lake, through that link service that we have, right? And I say, okay, there's that data folder, and we talked about it. I wanted to put it in my destination folder, and I can go ahead and hit OK. So that is the folder path. So specifically, it's actually a little more specific. This is actually my container, and then the folder path after it. What do we want to name the file itself? I'm going to go ahead and call this file, let's just call it emp.csv. Right, a simple one here, nothing too crazy. That's what I want to create. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. What's the file format? Am I going to create a Parquet file? Am I going to create an Avro file? In this case, I'm going to do a delimited text. I'm going to leverage a comma delimiter for here, and I'm going to say, you know what? Let's add the header into the file here, right? You have some choices that we can make. Pretty standard stuff. I'm going to do column delimiter, header. Yeah, nothing too crazy. And we hit next. And it says, okay, well, what's the name of your pipeline going to be? And I'm going to do something like Demo1 Copy Wizard. Something basic, nothing crazy. If you want to add a description in there, there are some additional more advanced elements you can do here where you can point to some reference table for data consistency rules. You can add additional logging so that if you want, you can add some additional details that'll be stored in a file that you can get into. Staging is really more so if you're going to be going into Synapse Analytics. So if you're going to be writing data into a SQL pool, staging can be beneficial there. Technically speaking, we're going from DB to data lake. The idea is when you're going from like data lake over into the SQL pool, you can get some cool performance gains if you use Parquet, actually. But if you're not using Parquet, staging will allow you to take advantage of that MPP architecture that exists there. So a lot of these little checkboxes, there's actually a lot of underlying information. And then it says, okay, hey, you know what? You're using this link service. It's tied to a specific integration runtime. Do you just want to allow it to automatically choose how many DIUs to leverage, which are called data integration units, as you can see here. It looks at your integration runtime, which is basically has a degree of scale. It's going to go from 4 to 20. Technically, if you scale your integration run up to the highest, I think you can do 256 DIUs. But as you can see, it's number of DIUs times the copy duration times 25 cents per DIU hour. It was mentioned earlier, hey, isn't the self-hosted more expensive? And the answer would be yes. I want to say it's like 0.27 or 0.28. We could see it in the documentation though, but it is a little bit more expensive there. Quite often though, when you're starting off, you can just leave this to auto. It usually does it in the most efficient way. For all of ours, it's basically going to use the lowest amount. It's going to use 4 DIUs for us, which is the lowest. So it's going to do that automatically. If you know you're hitting one of those walls of diminishing returns where it's using more DIUs but the speed isn't increasing, you could manually specify how many DIUs that you want to leverage here, right? So there are some options to be tinkering with. For us, we're just going to go ahead and hit next, which it kind of gives us a breakdown. Something we definitely want to kind of amend here though, which they actually did not have an option for this before, but they do now, which is awesome. We can actually go through the process and you can see this connection name is fine. We already created it. This is what I mean about setting up the data sets ahead of time. Look at the dataset name here. Source dataset EHT, destination dataset EHT. When they originally called it, this pipeline was called like pipeline something EHT. That's like how it's supposed to relate to it. They're not great. So this is where I usually, and before you couldn't rename data sets, but it's been a little while now that you now can. But I'm definitely going to hit edit on the source, and it actually lets me update and modify the actual name of this data set, which will be significantly better for us because once again, we can re-reference these data sets, right? We can actually use these for other items if we understand and know what it's pointing to. So this source is pointing to our SQL Server. Specifically, it's pointing to this table called dbo.emp. So I could call this something like AZ, if it lets me make the change here, there we go. AZ underscore, it's SQL database. Okay, well what table within this SQL database is it? And this is where I can say, if you wanted to, I could put the schema, something like this, EMP. So it's very obvious, this data set is pointing to this table within this server. It's going to be much easier to recognize this than this random kind of data set name. So I'll do the same thing for my destination and switch it over to something like AZ, ADLS. I like to ADLS. And then the file that's being created, we're going to call here employee. And if I want to, I could put like the format type in one, but it's going to create a file called employee. If I wanted to, I could have put the file path. It was data, destination, and technically employee. So like I said, you do want to take your time and think about the naming conventions here because we want to make it pretty evident and obvious, you know, what we are using this for. Because then, like I said, we could reuse this, which we actually will. So I have this set, I've updated those names. I think these look a lot better. So this is the review and finish. So as soon as I hit next, it's basically creating now this pipeline process of running this because we said run it once, run it now. So it didn't create a schedule, but you can see it's creating the data sets, creating the pipeline, and now it's actually running the pipeline. And it says that it's all said and done, that it's correct, that it's completed it. Has it? I head over to my data lake here. I'm just doing a quick little refresh and we can see there is a new item in here, this employee file. And if I look at it, we've got the contents, comma delimited like I told it to do right here. So yes, it did complete. It did place this inside of the data lake. It is now available to us. So with a couple of clicks, with following through a wizard, we've created our very first pipeline and it's gone through and run. And we can see now, if we go over to the author hub, there is a pipeline and 2 data sets. This is the results of our copy wizard. And this is actually what the pipeline UI normally would look like if you were to start things from scratch, which of course, from this point on, we're actually gonna do. But the wizard is there, it's great. Technically, you could go now and add on to this, right? It gave it the generic name of copy EHT. If you wanted to rename this, you could, but you're gonna see as we go through this, this is how this has been configured, right? And there's a bit more once you get beyond using the wizard itself. As you can see, there's a bit more of an impact. Sure, we pointed to our source data set, right? You can see it right here. This is what we're pointing to. And yes, I would like to leverage the table that's being referenced in here, right? We can see use query table. So it's basically saying use whatever is chosen, here, DBO EMP. That's cool. But notice, here's the interesting thing, and it gives you a little more versatility. Technically, we have a data set that's pointing to a linked service that's just pointing to that SQL Server and its respective database. Technically, even though this data set does have a table specified within it, you could literally just click on this little query button and you can go ahead and literally write your select statements, you can do joins, you can execute, you literally can do whatever you want actually. So technically speaking, this data set, although we pointed specifically to that employee table, we could literally query anything we want from that database from here. So it's an interesting idea and approach, and sometimes I've seen that done with data sets where you kind of just leave it open-ended and it requires the developer to come up with that query. So you can hard code things like we've done. You can leave it open for querying. As you can see, you can run stored procedures. These options that you see present here will change depending on what type of data set we choose. What if we ended up choosing our actual data lake for a source, right? In that case, we're not going to have options like table, query, and stored procedure. Those aren't things that exist in a data lake, right? It's going to be different. So we would see options like, hey, do you want to do a wildcard search within a folder? It gives you other choices. But this is the user interface. Now I made some changes to it, so I'm going to close out and not save those changes so I can keep it in its original state. But this is what the results are of the copy activity. It's kind of nice how it gets you started and just does a quick little example, right? So that is our first little pipeline, just kind of getting right into it. We have 2 data sets technically that could be used for any other pipelines or data flows, right? These are specific to what they're pointing to, right? We have our SQL database. If I want to pull and utilize this file in the data lake, this employee file, it's technically right there waiting for me, that we can take advantage of it. So pretty cool that that kind of has that kind of nice, easy kind of interaction. So that's our first item. Let's have the conversation on what we're going to do next. Now that we've seen what the copy activity can do, let's start talking about some of the other elements around the activities. Because, you know, this over here, this little canvas area, check out, I mean, there's a lot, right? If you kind of start expanding this, this is effectively the toolbox of all of the different activities that you have at your disposal. So for those of you who are new, who are just kind of thinking, I wonder what are the other things that we can do with the pipeline, you know? Can I go ahead and run a Databricks notebook? Well, yes, you can. Can I go over here and maybe go, if we go over, where's my Azure Data Explorer? There's actually under General, some pretty cool options. You can make web calls. You can go ahead and run as just a stored procedures. You can do scripts. And we're going to get into a couple of these, right? Here's our whole lift and shift stuff, execute an SSIS package. There's some stuff with data lake analytics, going with old school little USQL for anyone's. So there's a lot, right? There's a lot of cool capabilities and options that can be found inside of here for exploring. So definitely kind of check that out. The first activity that we're going to get into is going to be one that's called the get metadata activity. We're going to see there's been a lot of popularity and growth with storage accounts, you know, with data lakes. You hear quite often these conversations now around like data lakehouse. So we're seeing a lot more usage and investment from a storage perspective in data lakes, right? So the get metadata activity is going to be a great option when you are working with data lakes as a storage system. You can see it literally allows us to point to a file and or a folder and retrieve specific metadata information. And these are just a couple of options: item name, type, size, created, last modified. And we're going to use this effectively to kind of go almost to a degree through some kind of end-to-end examples. We're going to start small. We're going to add the get metadata activity. Then we're going to keep adding to that, adding to that, adding to that, to kind of show us a kind of a logical end-to-end process. But of course, I mean, when it comes to design and design choices and options for pipelines and data flows, the options are massive. There's so many things out there. So like I said, this is just the introduction. So hopefully it'll get you excited or whet your beak, so to speak, on what's going on here. And the first thing we're going to get introduced, and that's the whole kind of idea behind this get metadata activity, is, you know, the information that it is collecting, how do we leverage it down that pipeline? And we're going to see this is going to be utilized in many different fashions through the usage of what are called outputs. And there's a lot of different parameterizations that can go with it. We're talking about output parameters. There's generally just pipeline level parameters. There's some system level parameters. There's a lot actually available here, but this will be an example of what we're going to see. Hey, I got to get metadata activity. Let's go ahead and point it to this file. I'd like you to go ahead and give me this information, and this information. And we're going to take that input, that output part of me, and use it as input for other activities. That's going to be the idea. In our first case, we're going to end up connecting to the data lake. That's going to be our source for the get metadata activity. We're going to get that information. We're going to pass the details of it into a stored procedure, which is actually then going to actually update a table. That's the idea behind this one. So that's what we're going to end up doing as we go through this. So that's going to be the idea behind it. But what we will do, only because of timing, I don't want to go too far that break point, is we're going to go ahead and take that one break we're going to have in here, and then we'll continue afterwards. So it's just going to be a quick little 15-minute break. This is going to give me the opportunity also so that I can scroll through and see the plethora of questions, and then I'll probably get with Mitchell and see what kind of options are out there to kind of look into. But we're definitely going to get into that one so that we can see what's going on there. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to put a small little timer on the screen here, guys, and then we'll return. Just in case also, you may have noticed this as well, but there is an option here. There's a little QR code that you can go. I think we'll provide the link in the chat as well. But this is going to give you access, if you're interested, our on-demand learning platform. Tons of classes out there. We have an intro and an advanced ADF class on there too, but we have a limited time discount. So if you're watching this as a recording, you can see it's expiring on June 14th. So keep an eye on it, take a look. But like I said, we'll take a small break and then we will come on back. All right, guys, small little break. Now we're going to get back into the swing of things. We left ourselves off here. We have one pipeline in the bag. Now we're actually going to go through and we're going to start one pipeline that's going to end up being built upon, built upon, built upon. So first things first, let's just go ahead and create a brand new pipeline. So we can go make sure you're in the author tab. I'm going to shrink this to give myself a little more real estate. I'm going to go under pipelines. I'm going to go ahead and hit a new pipeline. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to kind of keep the same naming convention here and just call this demo 2. We're going to call this get metadata activity, right? Go ahead and pop that in there. And then once you get this set, you can see if you want a little more real estate, there's a little properties option here. We can go ahead and close that out. Also, when we go back here, guys, I did notice when we were checking out the chat, there actually was quite a few people that were asking about, hey, can I connect to this? Can I connect to that? What are my options? Real quick before I continue here, now I was thinking about it, Mitchell and I were talking about it. Don't forget, the way we do this is through linked services. Everything starts with linked services. That's where you choose what we want to make a connection to. So if you, once again, as a reminder, if you go to the Manage Hub and you go under linked services, if you just hit new, this scrolling list, which has its own little categories and breakdowns, these are all the things you can currently connect to. Some of them are a little more open-ended, like you see this one here just says file system. If you're looking to create a connection that's pointing to a file inside of your local private network, like in a network directory or your personal machine, this is what you'd have to choose. But don't forget, if that's the goal, you actually need to have an integration runtime that'll allow it. But you can see, you can go, you can scroll through all over the place here and see all of these different choices. We obviously can't go through every one of these today, but this is for you to know and understand what do I have available at my fingertips to connect to and work with. So once again, in the Manage Hub, under Link Services, just go ahead and scroll through that list. There's a ton waiting for us there. We're sticking with SQL Database and Data Lake, but there's so many more options. So we're here. We got our pipeline. Let's go ahead and find that get metadata activity, which I do believe is under the general section. But there's a lot in this little toolbox, so you can always type in what you're looking for and it'll filter it down. And once you found what you were looking for, you simply drag it into this canvas area. I'm going to go ahead and close out the little properties pane, give myself some more design space. But I mean, this is how we work with the pipeline. You have the toolbox here on the left of your various activities. You have the canvas area here just in the middle that we drag our various activities in, which you can have multiple activities in here. Obviously, the more activities you have, the longer it'll take for this to complete. And as we've talked about, that kind of affects billing. But here is my get metadata. And when you select it, the options below appear. Notice I deselected. These are pipeline level properties. When I click it, these are activity level properties. This bottom area will update based off of what we're pointing to. So these are the configurations for the get metadata activity. Step 1, let's go ahead and make it a name. Get last modified date. Right? This is what we're going to do. We're actually going to point to a file on our data lake. Specifically, if we go visit that data lake, if you remember earlier on, I had brought into the source location this just txt file, which once again, if we look at it, it's very simple, straightforward. It's effectively what we had. It just uses a different delimiter so we can explore what that looks like. But this file in the data lake is what I'm going to connect to for this get metadata activity, right? So that's what we're going to see in the settings for this activity. You can see it's in red. It tells me like what has to be configured is the data set. And if we think about this, I have an AZADLS pointing to an employee file that we just created. That's not what we want. And I have one that's pointing over here to this employee table in SQLDB. So technically, I don't have a data set that I want to work with. There's two ways we can approach this, right? You can see right here, there's a new data set option that I could do, or you could go in here and create a brand new data set as well, which is actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to click data sets, hit new data set. This almost looks identical to the experience for the link service, and it is. The list of data stores here matches what we have in the link service. We're basically saying, okay, what do you want to connect to? And when you make a choice here, you need to show us a link service that has a connection to that data store. So for us, we know it's data lake. So as I start to type that in, it filters it down. I can make my choice, and it says, all right, you're going to point to a file in the data lake. what is the format? And there's lots of options. Probably the most popular, fun one in here is probably Parquet. We're not going to be getting it into this class, but if you check out any of our stuff on like Data Factory and stuff like that, we have a lot of conversation around Parquet. It seems to be a format that's really being kind of pushed. There's a lot of performance benefits from using Parquet. So put that in the back of your mind to say, ooh, what's Parquet? That's definitely something to check out. We have some content on that as well. But here we're going to use that delimited text because that's what the file is set to, and I will hit continue. And now it's just kind of configuring now the data set. Like we did before, what do you want the name for your data set to be? Similar naming convention, ADLS, underscore, you put the name of your storage account possibly, but I'm going to put to the name of the file, right? It was input EMPTQ. That was the file that's right over here. So I'm just going to give it that name. So it says, okay, this is the name of your data set. What's your link service? Which data lake do you want to point to? Well, I've got one that points to the very one I'm interested in. And that says, all right, we're looking at the data lake. Which file are you interested in? Now, it should be noted once again, there are ways to actually make this. There was a question about dynamics. We're going to get into dynamic activities like setting parameterization. There's so many scopes and level of detail around parameters, but you could technically make this also dynamic. That gets a little more advanced, but we will get into some of the usage of dynamic expressions here in a little bit. But I just need to point to my file, right? I'm going to go in here under source. There's my input txt. And I say, okay, that's what I want to point to. It populates the necessary information. I can say, hey, you know what? I know the first row contains my headers in this because it's a delimited text. That's generally how it's always going to be. Fun thing, Parquet captures metadata as part of the file, and it actually has column headers and data types stored within it. Another cool, fun thing. So I can say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and this is going to be my data set. And we can preview it, right? There's a nice little option right here that says I want to preview the data. And when I preview this, we can see it actually doesn't look good, right? There's a couple of things that we need to switch, and the thing is our delimiter. It's actually not a comma delimited file here, which is how it's how we've set it. Technically, it's a pipe delimiter. Just from looking at it, we can see that it is pipe delimited. So after making this adjustment on the delimiter here, based off of what is contained in this file, making that small change, now this is how it should be. It's a readable file. Now I can consume it here. So I say, okay, I've got my data set all situated. Let me go ahead and use that data set I just created, AZ, ADLS, input EMP. And now once I've chosen it, it gives me the list of options that we can do, right? So we can see that there is this section here called field list. That's the kind of the key piece of this transform or this activity. And there's a bunch of choices. Now, and the interesting part is the options that you'll see present here will actually change. It changes depending on the data set. If the data set is set to a very specific file, you'll see the options you see right in front of you. If you point to just a folder, there's actually some additional choices that get brought up. But we're pointing to a file, and as we kind of specified, we're going to go with last modified. These are what metadata properties do you want to collect from this file. I'm going to do that, which is the one we wanted, but just to have fun also, I'm going to grab something like the size of the file, and also let's go ahead and grab the item name. And you can see there's other choices we could have added in the mix, but for the most part, this is what we're going to set. I'm going to go ahead, you don't necessarily have to do this, but I'm going to save it. And we haven't really talked about this, but saving inside of the Data Factory, the term here is called publish. The reason why it has the term publish is because you can tie this to something like GitHub or DevOps, so you could choose which branch you want to publish to. More on that, check out our Azure Data Services class, but I'm going to save this basically. In this context, by hitting publish, I'm saving these assets to my Data Factory. Right? What's that term? Save early, save often. So once this has been published, I'm going to go ahead and run this. And the beautiful part is I can run this right here, kind of in line, and say I want to go ahead and debug. And when I go ahead and debug, it's literally going to be running this inside of this designer area, and I get to see the outputs. You can see it's automatically changed to output, and we can kind of see that it went pretty quick. It took about 2 seconds, and it's done. Well, how do we see the results of this, right? Because all we did was connect to a file and ask for some metadata properties. Well, right here in this little section, in the output window, you can see there's an input window, which there's some details in here, nothing too crazy. And then we have, I think I might have accidentally just clicked the output. We have here, right? Last modified date, and you can see the time frame here. We have the size, 52 bytes, and the item name is input txtq. A small thing of note, if you notice the time here, it says today's date, because I uploaded this earlier, and you notice it's 15:26. you might have already kind of looked at it and realized 1526, hold on a second, this is going forward to 3 p.m., 4 hours. This is, whenever we work with ADF, with times in this regard, it actually does it in UTC. So you can kind of list that. So yeah, so we have it in here. That's just a couple of the metadata options. There's much more to choose from, but from here, we're gonna see how we can take advantage of these items, right? I've got a last modified date, I got an item name, that'll probably be the more useful. Size could be something, but we're really not gonna take advantage of that one. We're now gonna say, okay, now I'm getting details from a file. Let me go ahead and kind of log this information. Let me put this into a table and make note of it. So we're gonna go ahead and take the details of this and store it into a table. Give me the file name and give me the date. I'm also gonna take advantage of this though and do a little bit of the expression language, because there's some, the whole UTC thing is gonna cause a little bit of mischief here. So we definitely have to get involved with that. So get metadata activity, this is working, it's connecting, it's bringing whatever I choose from those options back for me so that I can use it with activities that'll show up later on down the line. So make sure it's saved, it's good to go. We're gonna create a third pipeline here. Let me bring this up, which is gonna end up using the stored procedure activity, right? Very popular, very common. We can kick off a stored procedure. Now there is a newer script task that you can do, so if you just want to kind of write out a script manually, you absolutely could do it, but usually for performance reasonings, if you want to bind this logic in a stored procedure, you will get some better performance. So in this case, we're going to take the output from the get metadata activity, feed it to parameters inside of a stored procedure, which is then going to insert it into a table, right? So the stored procedures could really be doing anything. The point is, inside of a pipeline, we can invoke a stored procedure, we can access its parameters, and we can, input whatever we want to that. So it's going to be pretty cool how we can leverage this. So of course, right now with our fresh database, we got to go ahead and make sure that we have the necessary items in here. So once again, inside of our resources folder, we've got under demo 3, we have a stored procedure, and we're going to create a table in here. So just like I did before, I'm going to add these objects real quick. Like I have my database, I'm still connected, and I can say, hey, I'm going to open up those 2 resources from the demo 3 folder. Let me open them both up. We can see that we have our creation of a table, Azure Metadata Test, file name, which we're going to capture from our output, last modified date, we're going to capture from our output, and then technically there's this record insert date, and we'll see we have some system parameters that we can leverage here, right? So we can go ahead and create this, right? I'm just going to go ahead and run this real quick. So have our table there created. So that's done, that's successful. And I'm also going to run this stored procedure, which as you can see, all it's doing is saying, hey, I want to insert into that table we just created the file name, the last modified date, and the record insert, but it's all going to be powered by these 3 parameters, which is going to be cool. We're going to see it inside of the actual pipeline. So let's run it. It's created. I've got these 2 objects. If we refresh it, Azure Metadata Test is now here, and you can see there's nothing in it, just so we can kind of validate this. There's nothing in there right now, but when this is all said and done, hopefully, we will have it in there. So let's take a look, and we're going to get introduced for the first time into our actual expression language with inside of Azure Data Factory. So this will be our first foray into this little realm. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to build upon this, but I'm going to keep my original demo 2 by itself. I'm just going to go ahead and hit the ellipsis next to demo 2 and clone it, right? Just going to make a copy of it basically, and I'll relabel this one demo 3, and we're going to call it the stored procedure activity, right? Just as we start adding stuff, we're going to go ahead and just put that name there. So I'm going to hide my properties, give me some more real estate. We know this is working, it's doing its thing, it's bringing back that information, so we're going to leave that configured as is. Technically there's some extra stuff, size is something we're not going to use, but I'll just leave it as is, and we're going to bring in our stored procedure. There we go. And you can bring it in. Now here's an important thing, right? We talked about this being an orchestration tool. This is how we can set things up to either execute in parallel or execute sequentially. From those coming from an SSIS background, you might remember things like precedent constraints. We don't have a similar thing like precedent constraint here, but still, we can see there's these little tails. I like to call them the little tails at the end of these pipelines, or pardon me, activities, which you can actually have it be for either success, failure, completion, or skip. So you can actually change what this is going to be. So if I want something, a pipeline activity, to only run if an activity fails, I can do that. I can create a failure branch and just connect it. So technically, this stored procedure would only run in this case if that get metadata activity failed. As you can imagine, when kind of thinking about the implications of this, we can kind of create some degrees of like notification framework. We don't cover that in this class. I actually do believe there are some videos on our YouTube channel that talk about this. And we absolutely talk about basically using Logic Apps or Power Automate to accomplish this. So definitely things to look forward to taking advantage of the ODL discount we have right now. But in this case, I don't want this to execute in parallel, right? I want the output. I want what we are discovering from this activity to flow into the stored procedure. So I do need to connect this, right? Which I'm going to do right here. And this is going to give me an opportunity, right? And I'll showcase this. There is a section for the expression engine, and you can take advantage of output parameters. If you don't have something like this connected, if it's in parallel, that will not appear. So let's go ahead and just give it a name, right? First, I'm going to go over to my name property. The name of this stored procedure was insert last modified. So I'm going to just give it the name. What stored procedure is this running? It's running my USP insert last modified. Literally, it's just the name of the actual stored procedure. And then we have to go to the settings. As you can see, there's a 2 there. There's 2 things I need to figure out. And it's asking me, okay, well, what is the link service? Interesting enough, it's not asking for the data set, and that makes sense. We just need to have a link service which points to the SQL Server and database, which contains the stored procedure I'm interested in. So we choose the link service we have to the database, and we're going to see that we have our insert last modified date right there. So that's beautiful. We have it there. I'm going to scroll this up a little bit. So we have this room. And you can see there's really not much to do here. This literally would run it, but remember, this stored procedure has 3 actual input parameters. And if I hit import, it actually reaches out to the stored procedure and brings us back the 3 parameters that are part of this definition. There is the file name, there's a modified date, and we can see there's a record insert date. And it brought it all back with the respective data types. So now we are left to populate the information that we are going to have written to this table. And 2 out of the 3 things we know are coming from the get metadata activity, right? So here is where we can make things interesting. If you just start to type in the value, literally, that's static, right? Oh, input, EMP, whatever it was, right? We could just type it in here and sure, that'll get written. But we want to make this more dynamic, right? We're searching for something using getting metadata activity. Give me whatever that name is. So I go over to this add dynamic content, and this introduces us to effectively kind of like the expression language that exists here. And you can see that we have quite a few options, right? System variables, there's quite a few things. Functions, there's quite a few things. And then of course, we have the activity outputs, which is open by default. And you can see that what happens here is this is pointing to the name of the preceding activity. If I had a third activity, I would actually see outputs from both of those, but it's only because I've connected this. As you can imagine, if I did not connect the stored procedure, I wouldn't have any prior outputs. So we can see here that I'm listing, and we're talking about the file name property. So I would like from the get metadata last modified date activity, the item name. That is the name of the property that contains this. We saw this in the previous example. So all I need to do is point to this, it populates the code in question, and I can hit OK, and it gets put right here. So take whatever's coming from get the metadata, which remember right here, what was it? Item name is right here. So it's going to give me that value within this execution. That is what this is achieving, but it's doing it dynamically. The next one seems pretty straightforward, right? That we could go ahead and say, oh, we need to put the modified date, right? That was what we were collecting. If you remember, it was called last modified. If we look at that property again, right, we can see it was at the top here, last modified. So that's what we want from the output, right? Well, we do recall that the get metadata is effectively bringing this into UTC. So what we can do here is do a little bit of logic. By default, we would think, okay, Let's go in here. I'm going to click on this, go to dynamic content, and of course, we're going to see get metadata, last modified date, and we want last modified. So it's right here. So technically, we pop this in, and it is going to bring that back as is. But remember, that was like 15 something. It was 4 hours ahead. So the fact that I know that, I could add some additional logic in here, right? We could go ahead and do an add. There's actually multiple things we could do here that we could address this. Under functions, you can see there's some date-related functions. You can add to time, add to hours. You can convert to UTC and stuff like that. In our case, what we would want to do is basically make sure that I'm going to do an add hours on here. What do we want to add hours to? I'm going to go ahead and this is getting a bit more. Actually, I'm going to save this because it gets more involved. Since this is our first kind of interaction with the formula language, let's just stick to what we know so we can see those results that I'm talking about. I'm going to go ahead and get last modified date. But once again, we know that this is going to put in that, I think it was 15, using the military time, the 1529 or whatever, when realistically it should have been 1129 or whatever it was, whenever we added that file, right? This guy right here, 1126, but it's giving us 326. So we'll leave that as for now, and we'll see that in a second when we write it to the table, but then also there's a record inserted date. So this one, technically, we don't really have this, but I'll show you a little bit of what we can do here because we do have, hey, in the dynamic content, if we look under functions, under date, there is like a, if you've ever worked with like today or now functions in Excel, we do have a UTC now property, right? So it's right there. We can do this, but obviously that's going to return the time in UTC. So the fun part is we can see there is an option here called convert from UTC. So I'm going to say convert from UTC. Okay, what do you want to convert from UTC? The UTC now. And the only other argument here is simply to state, all right, this is UTC, you want to convert it from UTC to what? And there's quite a few reserved keywords here. There's custom formats, but since I'm in the East Coast, I'm going to go with Eastern Standard Time, right? I'm just going to go ahead and set that up to be convert from UTC, UTC now, Eastern Standard Time, right? That is the logic we're going to use here. And we now have the 3 parameters for the stored procedure using dynamic content that's going to be coming from, well, 2/3 of it's going to come from get metadata, and the last one I'm actually going to be using kind of a built-in system function, UTC now, and just converting that, right? So that's what we're going to be leveraging here. So technically, I could save this, right? We didn't create any new data sets or anything like that. It's just the pipeline. So the idea here is we should be able to run this. We already know the get metadata is going to work. It's all about, are we receiving that information correctly into the store procedure and then being able to write it to the actual table. So let's go ahead and hit debug. Let's let it do its thing, right? We'll give it a sec to kind of queue up and start running. Sometimes it'll take a moment, but we saw the last one went pretty quickly, just kind of provisioning those resources. There we go. You can see this switched over here. It's now queued. I've noticed this little refresh button hasn't been behaving as nicely for me. It switched from queued to in progress. Let me just check real quick here. Oh, you gotta kind of spell this right. You see Eastern Stand? That's not gonna work. You gotta put a valid format, Eastern Standard Time. So you can see that's a good example, though we didn't get to see that yet. What does error logging or error information look like inside of pipelines? Where we are extracting the output stuff, which is absolutely very helpful in the same kind of degree. If there's an error, naturally you're not going to get your standard output, but you can see here it gives me the error name. The function UTC was, you didn't have a valid value passed through, and we got to see what the problem was. So after making that adjustment, I'm going to go ahead and rerun this debug. It should kind of queue and process relatively quickly here. And And let's see here, there we go. So the get metadata successful. The stored procedure is processing, took about 3 seconds. The one thing to note is when dealing with a stored procedure, you actually don't get really any output that you can use past this. So if we had more activities, you don't get really anything too useful. You can see there's some billing information. It tells you like what was the duration of the execution, what was the runtime, some small things, but you don't really get a lot of stuff you can leverage for that. And that's one of the common things that's known for stored procedures in pipelines is you don't really get outputs. So if you're going to be using stuff like stored procedure and you want to kind of look or acquire the results of what that did, you would have to use other pipelines such as like a lookup activity to kind of go to the table that you just wrote against to maybe return some results if that's what you're looking to do. So do remember, just kind of keep in mind that stored procedures don't really have an output we can leverage. But let's go to our table, right? The idea is if we go over here and we run this, we have our file name, which we know that's correct. Our last modify date, we did take the UTC as is. To make this adjustment, we would have to do a bit more, but what I'll do is moving forward, we will advance what we're writing inside of this, these arguments. So we'll add to that. You can see our inserted date, though, did take the time that is right now. That whole convert from UTC, if we hadn't done it, that would have been, you know, the 1701 type of deal. But this one did convert it. That's going to be good. That's exactly what we're looking for. So you're seeing, now we're starting to use outputs. We're getting through the process. We're kind of getting this situated. So we're going to continue and build this out. The end goal of this, which we're going to have a small little imagery is, hey, let's take a look at the last modified date of a file. Then let's look at maybe some value coming from a table. We're going to see it's called a control table. And let's compare these dates together, right? Let's take a look and see which one is sooner. So if the file in the data lake has a newer modified date, that means something's changed and updated since the last time we loaded it, let's go ahead and process that copy data activity, right? That's going to be the overall kind of idea behind this. We've got our last modified date, but obviously we don't have really something to compare it to from a control table, which is what we're going to do next. But this is so far doing what it needs to do. I'm going to go ahead and publish this and save it. And we're going to make some adjustments here and bringing in another activity. There's so many that we can tinker with. So right now, though, we're seeing what are the results of our get meta activity and writing that in. So now we're going to kind of replace, for the moment, that stored procedure activity with actually a lookup activity, right? I was just describing how the stored proc doesn't really have an output, but a lookup activity is something that we can connect to, and this is that general design that we're going to leverage, right? We're going to have a lookup activity that gets the last load date. They say the last time that we used a copy activity or something like that. We're going to then use the get meta activity to get the last modified date. And the idea is that we're going to compare them, and depending on if one is greater than the other, we're going to do some sort of actions. You can see this is going to lead to an if condition. That'll probably be the last one that we get into before we swap over to Dataflows. So that is the design pattern that we're going to leverage, right? The lookup activity is going to allow us to pull a data set. There's definitely a couple of choices and options on how we can do this. You can either have it return a single value, so literally a checkbox that says, hey, just return me the first row, depending on the nature of your query. That may or may not make sense. Or you can return an entire array or object. So that'll change the actual code that you have to write to bring back these results. Because remember, lookup activity is going to bring back results, and then we need to leverage it. That's the idea behind it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to further augment this pipeline by we're going to clone it, and we're going to add more, and we're going to go ahead and bring in the lookup. And we're going to see how we can kind of make this work. We could choose potentially to make this hard-coded, or we could run it in parallel. There's kind of really two directions we can take here. But let's kind of follow what we were talking about, right? Let's go ahead and we'll set this up so that we're going to create a couple of assets here. So let me go ahead and clone this, right? We're going to call this demo4. We're going to switch this over to lookup activity. All right, just like that. I can kind of knock off the third one here. And let me hide the property so I have a little more real estate. And like I said, I'm actually going to get rid of the stored procedure here. But once again, I do need to add some assets to my actual SQL Server here. Demo4, we're going to create a control table. We're going to have a last load date and an execution date. So I'm going to kind of write all these into my SQL database really quickly. So just like we did before, just kind of copy all this and just run it. So I'm going to go over here. We're going to go ahead and open up a new query. And it's going to be under demo 4. And we can see, right, here we're creating a table called control table. Source is just going to contain the name of a file. So in our case, we're going to literally put in the file that we're looking at, because this is the same name of what we're looking at in the data lake. So we're going to say, hey, I've got a source item here called input, TQ-TXT. The last time that it was executed was, you can see, I just have a date pretty far in the past in 2021. But this is going to create this table with this actual entry in there, right? So effectively, we're going to be bringing back this and comparing that to the last modified date from our file. So very clearly, the last modified date is going to be greater than, right? That's going to obviously be the newer of the dates, the closer of the dates. So that'll obviously, when we get to if conditions, say, yes, it's greater than. So that's 1. Let's make sure it's in there, right? There's our control table, so I can close out of that. We have a stored procedure here. That's where we're going to see it says, hey, I want you to grab the execution date from the control table where the source equals, and then you can see we're passing a parameter in here, right? So we're going to have to kind of parameterize that, but this is what we're going to end up using for our lookup transform. So that's written, that's good. And then lastly, we're going to have this item here, which is going to basically, we kind of have to go through, once we get this set up eventually, we need to update that control table, right? That execution date. If that doesn't get updated, then we're not, that kind of logical condition of, hey, is the lookup, is the last modified date greater than the execution date? If we don't update that table, then that condition is never going to change, right? So we're going to have a stored procedure, which is going to help us kind of update that so we can make sure this logic is being contained. So 3 objects in there, 3 objects created. So now that they're there, I've gone ahead and we can adjust this. Get metadata, staying the same. We're not making any changes in this realm, but we are going to bring in a lookup, right? So the lookup itself is going to end up running a stored procedure. So we're going to start on that front. So I'm going to go find my lookup. We can see that here. Bring that in. Connect the dots. Technically, so I modified the stored procedure so it can use a parameter. So we need to leverage the output from the get metadata activity to obviously feed into this actual lookup. If I wanted to, I technically could have just hard coded this where we only have 1 record in that table. I could have ended up running this in parallel as well. But we have our lookup. We might as well kind of give it a name. We can just call it lookup last execution date. Last execution date from our control table. And then we're going to leverage the stored procedure that we leverage. So as always, it's asking us for the source data set. Technically, we have this one here, and you're like, wait, that's pointing to the employee table. But don't forget, when we leverage this in the activities, we can choose, do I want to use the table, or do I just want to use a stored procedure, right? When I leverage the stored procedure, this is going to make life a little bit easier, and I can say, I just want to run the stored proc. So I'm effectively ignoring the whole pointing to the table. And in our case, our stored procedure is last load date, right there. And if we import the values in here, we know we have 1 item that's called name, and we just need to give it a value. And as before, we're just going to take advantage of an output coming from the get metadata activity. Hopefully you're starting to see that using these outputs as inputs is what it's all about. But I can go ahead and say, hey, I need the item name from the get metadata activity. That's what's going to populate a value for this parameter. So the idea here is we need to return back. So at the end of the day, we're going to have 2 values that are going to be returned here. There's still a little bit of a question mark, right? Because we know that the get metadata activity is bringing back UTC. What is the lookup going to return? If we carefully look at the table itself, right? Let's take a look. We can see that it's 6:13. Basically, I just put it at 12 o'clock, right? Right on the dot. I made it nice and even. So is that going to return 1600, right? The whole UTC thing. Is it being impacted in the same way, right? You can have some guesses if you like. I'm going to go ahead and publish this, and let's go ahead and run this. We're going to watch. We know the get metadata activity is going to go. It's going to execute. It's going to be successful. That's run multiple times. The question here is what's going on with the lookup. And once again, let's remind ourselves, even though it should say 1126, we know we get 1526. So we're going to have to deal with that. Because if we're comparing that, you know, we know everything's in Eastern, because if I look, what is the value from my lookup? 12. It didn't adjust this at all. It didn't go 4 hours, anything like that. So like, that's a bit of an issue. We're comparing something that's being stored in a SQL table, and I'm storing it as Eastern, but the last modify, which is showing as Eastern inside of the UI for the data lake, is coming as UTC in here. So there's a 4-hour difference, which is going to cause some oddities if we're comparing it, right? It's just not going to be the right type of comparison that we're needing. We need to kind of take advantage of the details of this. So that is going to have to happen here in the next activity. Because remember, we technically now have 2 dates and 2 times. Now we're going to have to compare them. And this is where you can get to some standard kind of logic known as an if condition. I think this one's pretty fun. I think this is very widely utilized, so that's what we're going to modify for this now, right? The if condition is going to be this middle piece. I've got 2 times. Let me take advantage of those and do a comparison. And if the last modified is greater than the last execution date, then I want to do, basically has a true or false section. If it's true, then do these activities. If it's false, then do these activities. That's the idea. And the idea would be is if the last modified date, right, if that is greater than the execution date, that means there's new data in there. Let's go ahead and process a copy activity and actually move the data from the data lake, let's say, to a table in the SQL database. Well, if the execution date is actually greater than, so in this case, if it evaluated to false, if the last modified is not greater than the last execution date, that means nothing's changed in that file. So we don't need to run any sort of copy activity. That would be redundant, right? So that's the idea behind this, right? We're going to use that if condition, which is going to give us that capability of performing specific activities should something evaluate from either true or false. That's what we're going to get into. So I'm going to go ahead, clone this, right? Do kind of the same thing we've been doing. I'm going to say this is 5, and we will go ahead and call this, 1 second. Let's go ahead and call this our if condition activity. Technically, it's if condition activity. All right. And we're going to keep it as is, but what we're going to bring is a new activity into the mix, right? And in this case, we are going to have to take advantage of a little bit of extra work here because we are going to have to take advantage and make sure we're doing that conversion, right? So we need to make that type of change. So let's go ahead and bring in our if. Bring that in here. We're going to connect it. You can already see there's kind of multiple parts to this. There's the actual if condition itself, and then what do we want to do if it's true? Then what do we want to do if it's false? So let's go into the if condition. If we want, we can kind of relabel this if we'd like. We can go ahead and give this, what did I end up calling it? So maybe we could just say if condition test dates. I'm just going to put it in there. And then we're left with our activity. And you can see this is the expression. This has to be something set so that it will evaluate to either true or false. That's the idea behind it. So when we go through here, we can go ahead and open the dynamic contents. And we want to do, and we're going to leverage a function here that's going to be called greater or equals. And you can see returns true if the first argument is greater than or equal to the second, right? Note, and it gives you a little, note values can only be of integer, float, or string. So it gives us this example, right? So that's what we're going to end up using. But there's a bit more that's going to go into this mix. So I'm going to kind of go to the next line of code because we know what we want to test is the last modified date greater than or equal to the execution date, right? That's the idea behind it. So we have to kind of take a gander. So before I get into writing this, we also want to make sure we look at the last one. Let's look at this again. It is first row dot execution date, right? We got to remember what the output is. Now the interesting part is this potentially could be done. You can see if I wanted to. This is only because I did a first row. If you unchecked it, if you were bringing back multiples, it actually brings back an array. But we're going to keep it here, and I'm going to keep this as a reference so we can come back and remind ourselves how we end up writing this, right? First row dot execution date. So we'll keep that there. Okay, now we have that in mind. So we know we want to use greater than or equal. So I go find that expression. I'm going to move to the next line. So we know the first argument is I'm going to use my last modified date. Technically speaking, I actually have to go through and we're going to go ahead and set it so I have 4 hours reduced from it, right? I want to take 4 hours away from what I've written here. So to write this, I'm actually going to go and leverage the add hours, right here. And you can do this in negative. There's add time, add day, add hours. I'm going to go ahead and add hours here. And then what do we want to add hours to? Well, that of course is going to be for our, if we scroll down, it's going to be our last modified date right here, right? Well, there is a small nuance here. And the trick here is we need to make sure that this is formatted in the appropriate, it has to be a date time. And the way it's actually coming in is actually in a string. So what I'm going to do is actually go in and find there's a format date option. So you can see as you start to kind of want to elaborate and get this set, there's quite a few things that you might have to kind of set up here. So I actually add in a format date time. Okay, well, what do we want to format? This is where I can now choose my activity in question that we talked about. And I'll put this entire code on the screen. Let me actually, I'm going to bring it to the next line. I think it'll be easier to read that way. Format date time. What do we want to format? We want to format this. How do we want to format this? You can see it's kind of tricky sometimes lining this up. Actually, I need, that is my format date time. Got to match up the items. So yeah, it's right after this. There's multiple options we can do here. This is just kind of doing a standard date time format. There's long format, there's long short, like long date format. There's a ton. I highly recommend checking out the format date time. There is a ton of predefined options in here. This is the one we're going to utilize for this option. And then let me actually go here because now we're in the add hours. So I'm going to say get 4 hours less, right? That's one. And then technically, if I go to the next line, because it's getting a little crowded over here, let me go back, we need to make sure we wrap up the actual greater or equals. So we can match up. We have this parentheses is matched here. Perfect. So yes, we just need to go ahead and make sure that we have our second argument, right? We have our last modified date, but now we're comparing it to the item that's coming from our lookup, which we should see that actually, right? We have our lookup last execution date. We can see that right here. Value dot, and then we can put this here as, what was it, first? I gotta remember first name. I'm gonna put this in here for now and hit OK because I'm gonna go revisit, because you need to be very specific, right? What was that one again? First row dot execution date, right? That's what I need. So I can go in here. Let me fix that. First, when you start dealing with arrays, unfortunately, it doesn't have the whole thing. So you notice, like, when we have our standard kind of JSON outputs, we get those extra options. But in here, since it's an array, it actually doesn't bring that back for us. Execution date. So we just need to be very specific. So we're doing a test, right, to compare if our last modified date, which we've now formatted, and make sure we go back 4 hours, which in our case, it doesn't matter, right? Even if we go back 100 hours, it's definitely going to be the greater value than our what's in our control table, right? That's going to be clear and evident. I think our execution date was back in 2021 or something, right? 2021. But we still need to make sure that comparison is occurring correctly here. So we're doing a condition, and we know in this case it should evaluate to true. So, and just in case also, like I said, if I wanted to, a big thing deals with the first row settings. If you, once again, if you were to uncheck this, you actually can specify specific items in the array. So we'll leave it as is. I'm going to go ahead and just for a test, because we have to configure, right? It's going to return true or false. What do we want to do if it's true or if it's false? So I'm going to go if it's true. This is like a small thing we do for quick testing. I'm just going to run a wait activity. All this literally does is wait 1 second by default. That's all it does. But I can give it a name. And I'm going to call this true. And then if I go over to the false condition, I'm just going to go ahead and put in here false. So as long as all that code is done correctly, this should compare the times, and what we should see is the true activity runs and the false one will not. Let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we'll see. There's a lot of extra code that got put in there inside of our if condition. So when you starting to really nest stuff in and kind of work with conversions and stuff like that, sometimes it can get tricky, right? And you can see here, there's probably something wrong with that. I think I might have typed it in correctly. That's what it was. Yep. So we just need to make a change. There was a little bit of extra hung out here, right in the, I believe it should just be like that. Output.firstRow.executionDate. The value was technically the entire object, so I need to be more specific of what object I'm looking for. So I looked at it and I didn't think it was supposed to be there. I didn't pay attention. The error message let me know though, hey, you're pointing to something that's not going to work for the sake of comparing it. I was basically trying to compare an object or an array against an actual single value. So you can see it's working now because I fixed that. And what we should see is you can see only the true condition passed. We were comparing, you know, we changed it to 11/26 of today compared to whenever the heck it was from last year. So obviously true is going to be the case. But naturally it's at this juncture that we would want to kind of elaborate and add to this logic, right? The weights, those are just placeholders, right? That's all we had that there just to test this out. This is where we want to go through the process and actually put some real stuff to be accomplished inside of this, right? So we can choose if we wanted to actually like use a copy activity and say, hey, let's go ahead and point to that very same file that's been modified, and let's go ahead and write it out to a table or something of that nature. We could actually end up having that be the process, but we've already used a copy activity, so we don't need to do that again. But something we definitely do want to do, and technically, let me see here. We have the employee table. Let me see real quick. Yeah, we have that employee table. So like I said, we've already done that copy activity. So the main thing is we got to make sure that we update our table. So we need to use that store procedure and make sure that the value in this control table gets updated with whatever timestamp this gets run. So then our execution date will be updated. The next time we run it, it should return a false condition, right? That should be the idea. So I'm going to go ahead, bring in that stored procedure. I know we've done this one before. We're going to go ahead and run the stored procedure that we added in. That was just called USP update. Oh, if it lets me type, come on. There we go. USP underscore update execution date. And we configure, right? I just need a link service which points to the respective database. This is the same one we'll be using. We need to find the update last execution date. Boom. And do we have here? We just need, okay, one parameter. What are we going to update the execution date for, right? So we only have the one record in there, so it's going to update this. For us, there's really two options. Now, I know I've talked about and showcased UTC now. Technically, we could use UTC now, right? Under the date functions, we've already seen UTC now. But something of consideration here is that you may have quite a few activities occurring. You can see right now we're only at 3 activities deep, but you can imagine there could be many more activities. You technically could be calling a second pipeline, and you have it set to wait till that pipeline completes to continue down whatever logic you have here. So technically, when this pipeline begins compared to when this activity actually runs and this stored procedure actually runs, you could be talking about minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. There could be a long distance in time. So if we're making and doing all these adjustments, if we were to use UTC now, that would take it at the moment that the stored procedure activity ran. But if there's a bunch of logic happening in before this, there's a chance that there could be this gap, right? Where we update the time frame to something that happens right now, but what if we were making adjustments to that file, right? We could create this kind of odd gap in here where we could effectively miss out when an update occurs to that last modified file. If it got modified during the execution of this, we would want that to basically be captured so we would run it again and the next time we checked on this. But if we wait to this point to use UTC now, that could be a problem. The reason why I mention it is there's other things too. Under system variables, technically, we have another option in here that's just simply called the pipeline, right? So pipeline, there should be a pipeline trigger time when the actual pipeline starts running. So that's what we're going to end up leveraging, right, inside of this item. And I make sure, I should only have one. Cool. I only have the one item here, so it's perfect. I'm going to go ahead and point to that very system variable, pipeline, trigger time. That's it. Nothing crazy in here. Now, granted, let's not forget that is going to be in UTC. We kind of did UTC now, so I'd want to do the same thing, right? I'd want to go ahead and find the whole function where it's going to convert from UTC. We want to convert from UTC. What do you want to convert from UTC? The pipeline trigger time. And then what do you want to convert this to? And this time around, hopefully we spell it correctly, Eastern Standard Time. Literally, you can put Pacific. I mean, all the time zones are there. Like I said, if you go and check out the actual convert from UTC, it talks about the available custom and standard options you have here. There's actually a ton going on in this realm. So technically speaking, this is now set. Now, if we run this once, right, if we go back over here and we execute this, we know what's going to happen. It's going to execute and result as true. We haven't changed or updated anything yet, so this should run through, be successful. It'll, this time around, actually execute the stored procedure. I'll give it a second here. So it's doing that. You can see it is running the stored procedure. It is not using anything in the false category. We'll give it a second to let that complete. Maybe. Successful. So to make sure this is successful, I can run over here and see 69329 right now, right? It's got it right as it is at this moment. So technically speaking, this is now going to be greater than the last modified. So if we run this again, we should see now that this is going to execute and go down the false path. And if it goes down true, that means that we have some issue with that conversion, the add hours, which was bringing it back 4 hours. That means there's an issue with that. We might have to look at that once again. Pretty sure I put -4. No, I'm thinking about it. I wonder if I just put it as 4. Nope, it went down the false condition, so I did write it correctly. So this is kind of a quick look at something that's actually pretty impactful when you're trying to do some like audit logs or control tables, or there's other things also known as task queue tables. This is how we can kind of create a degree of control here on, hey, how often do I want to run this? I have this pipeline. It will move data from A to B, but I only want to do it when A has actually been updated. So this idea of leveraging control tables and kind of comparing those time frames, this can help kind of impact overall. It's going to be cost, right? Yeah, so in this case, that's how we're doing it. And just in case, UTC right now is 4 hours ahead, so that's why I went 4 hours back. So that's just for me. That's the difference right now with our time zone. Of course, you kind of have to adjust it for others. You got to consider daylight savings isn't playing stuff like that. But UTC right now is a +4 to east. But yeah, so you can start to kind of think about how we could put these things into play. Control tables, it's all about using these outputs. You got to see how we can use these outputs, and you can go even further into this realm of parameterization, right? This little kind of expressions window, there is quite a bit we can do in here. I mean, there's many different categories, many different sections in here that we could dive into, we could explore, we could look at. I mean, just look at all the categories. So definitely a ton of room to grow here. 5 quick activities, kind of moving through, seeing how we can start to make this, and you're hopefully starting to see overall kind of this is a kind of a design pattern that you could implement yourself. So that right there is what I have slated for right now for our pipeline experience, right? There's, once again, let's not forget pipelines, orchestration, and data movement. We focused here on data movement, but as looking through that toolbox, you could once again run Databricks, run other pipelines, run data flows. Technically, when we look here at data flows, we're going to go through one data flow kind of beginning to end. How do we run this data flow? It's going to be through a pipeline, right? So a little bit of a different UI. We still use data sets in this process, but this time we actually have some choices of actual transformations that we can accomplish here, right? So you can actually make some transforms. So you can see similar looking display, but there is no toolbox, there's no activities. You basically work with this little plus symbol here to choose what is the next object, what's the next transformation I'd like to do. Am I gonna put a sync? Am I gonna do another transform? You need to have at least one source and one destination or one sync. That's what kind of makes a data flow valid. You can't save a data flow until you have it that way. But there's a ton. And actually, this, oh, I have it on the next slide, never mind. I included this last minute because I know we briefly talked about Parquet earlier. We're not going to use it for this example, but once again, to iterate, there's been just such a growth in popularity with this file format. Since we've been working and talking about the data lake so much, we've been using delimited text for our example, but when you start getting into using pipelines and data flows, you're bound to run into kind of this conversation of, hey, if you're moving in data from the data lake to SQL pools, you very well want to consider Parquet. It is a kind of column-oriented data storage. It is in a compressed state, and it captures metadata. It actually stores column headers as well as data types. So it's a very efficient storage method, and you get some pretty huge performance gains when using Parquet. So definitely something to check into. Now here's something interesting. Remember earlier when I reminded you how you could go over to the Manage Hub, you can check out Hit Link Service, and you had this nice, long, sprawling list of data stores, 90 plus connections, right? It was beautiful. Well, when it comes to direct connections, valid or compatible data sets, let's say, for your data flow, it actually changes. This is pretty much, you can kind of see here to a degree in the bottom right corner that this is actually grayed out. We'll see it for ourselves in the data flow, but you don't have an ability to directly connect to all of those data stores. It's a fraction of it. Literally what you see in front of you are the valid data stores to connect to your data flows. That's it. Once again, this is why we talked about pipelines. That's the data movement tool. If I want to connect to Amazon S3, which is not in this list, making sure I'm not making that up, it's not in this list, I would need to use a pipeline first, connect and get the data that I'm interested in, move it into one of these options that's available to me, and then I can leverage a data flow. So it's just a small consideration. You actually have a smaller selection of data stores that are compatible with data flows. So we're going to see that for ourselves. You have quite a few transformations. Some of these terms are going to feel a little bit familiar if you're coming from an SSIS background. And we do have our own expression engine. We do have our own expression builder here. It's different than what we have in pipelines. This one obviously is driven more from a transformative and an aggregation perspective, so it's a bit more robust. But quite often you're going to be taking advantage of this, right? So also, I put in the screenshot when we choose our destination, we are limited to that smaller sub-selection of choices. So it's a smaller set of data stores that we have to connect with. So we do have to kind of keep that in mind. So this is the last example we're going to run through that'll bring us to the end of today, which we're going to create a source, and we're going to see we have a couple of files that we're going to upload. we're going to go ahead and kind of combine that with a second source. So we're going to do a lookup, and we're going to see what that's about. We're going to go ahead and use a derived column so that we can add a new column which adds a 10% to the weight, so we can account for a padded weight amount. And we're going to see our data set contains quite a few products that don't have a list price. We're going to filter those out, and then we're going to sort it and, of course, write it out to a file into the data lake. So that's going to be the grand scheme of this scenario. Since we're going to be working through this one and really putting our heads down and focusing on getting through this data flow demonstration, I did want to put a small reminder, because I know we're going to get cutting it close to the wire here, guys. Reminder one, this is going to be recorded. It's going to be put up on the channel, so you can take your time, you can pause it. You're going to be able to go through all these examples for yourself because it is included inside of the download. And don't forget, within the more descriptions as well, there is a certificate of completion that you can kind of go through for spending your time with us this morning / afternoon, whatever it might be for you. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and knock out the remainder of what we have here for our data flow. So first and foremost, there is a pretty fun and cool feature that I want to kind of showcase, and it kind of illustrates into how data flows actually execute. So just over here, I'm going to start by creating a brand new data flow. You can see I have a name here. We can go ahead and just call this something like data flow demo, right? And I'll close it so I have more surface area. And then it just has a little button that says source. But right above it, there's this interesting option. Remember in the pipelines, we had a debug option. This has the word debug in it, but it's data flow debug. So what does this do? Interesting enough, when I click on it, a little blade appears and it says, oh, you want to turn on data flow debug? Okay, tell us an integration runtime that you would like us to utilize effectively to manage this resource. Well, what resources do you speak of? What happens here with data flows? It's actually provision. You can see it says here, getting the cluster ready. When we do this, it's going to leverage and create a Spark cluster. The way that data flows actually executes is that when you run this, like when we look at it in an unattended fashion, is that it actually will translate whatever it is that we're doing, like whatever shows up in this user interface, this design area. We're going to use a UI. We're going to define all of these different things. It actually translates that into something called Scala, and it actually has to execute this on a Spark cluster. So it's built differently than actually pipelines. But by turning on Dataflow Debug, we get a really fun, interesting user interface experience. And you're going to see that as soon as we get this started. But first is first. I like to, and if we see, if I click Add Source and we hit New, it's the data store, but it looks a little different. Check this out. It goes, and all of a sudden, all these things start getting grayed out. These are not supported inside directly connecting with data flows. This is what I was mentioning. Now this does change, right? I have seen new items being added all the time for this process. So this happens quite often, right? So definitely something to consider, definitely something to check on, just because there's always and continuously changes being made. Now for us, our sources that we're going to use for this are right here. This product model lookup and this products all. So I need to go ahead and make sure that I have this in my data lake. So like I've done before, I'm just going to go over here into my source folder, which I think is right here actually. I think I was just in it. And I'm going to go ahead and just upload those very two items that I have there in the resources demo 6. I'm just going to put them both inside of this location so I can leverage it and create some data sources against it, some data sets against it. Let's go ahead and create the data sets, right? First is first, let's connect to that products all. That is a list of, you can see it's going to have like 23 columns in there. It's all of our products. The one thing it's missing is the product model description, which will be what we do second. So first and foremost, new data set. I'm going to add that right here. We are going to point to our data lake once again. This is going to be a delimited text, right? And then let's go ahead and give it, that naming convention treatment we've been doing, Azure, ADLS, and this is going to be pointing to that products all file, products all. Which data lake do you want to connect to? So as you can imagine, you can have multiple data lakes in there. Which file do you want to point to? I'm going to go and navigate right to that location where I just placed products all. First row has headers. Now remember, when we bring this in here, I always like to go ahead and preview this. How is it looking? Not great. This is another scenario where our column delimiter is not a comma like it's using by default. Instead, it's actually a pipe. So I want to go ahead and make sure that I specify this as being the pipe. And once I go here, if I were to go ahead and preview this, looking much, much better. The one thing that you won't want to do as well is this schema is going to have an impact on us. There's a deeper conversation to be had here. That would be for a different day. But I'm going to go ahead and import this schema from the connection store. Now that I've defined it correctly, because it was using the whole comma delimiter, the pipe, we want it so it looks good. And now the preview looks good, right? Boom, yes. Dataset 1. Dataset 2, right? Need to go over here, and this is going to go ahead and be our product models. So we can open this guy up. We're going to do another Azure Data Lake. So I'm going to search that up. It's going to be delimited text. And this time it's AZ_ADLS. And our file there was called, I think, product model lookup. So I'm just going to go product model here. It's in the same data lake. And I'm going to point to that file. There we go. And I think this one is comma delimited. We'll find out here in a second, right? I'll do a quick little preview. Pretty sure it is, though. And it is. You can see it's a smaller file. It really just contains product model ID and the actual model name. So that'll give us a little more transparency. Like over here, if we kind of look at product, you can see this gives us our product ID, the product name, but like the model name, we don't have it. So this is going to add a little extra detail. This is not uncommon when you think about dimensions and stuff like that. So 2 data sets ready to go. Now I can take advantage of them inside of this actual data flow. So let's rename our first source. Let's call this products all right? And it's going to ask us, of course, what data set. And I can go ahead and point to, let's point to product all. There we go. We've already tested that, and you can see we have a schema here, 23 columns. Now remember this Dataflow debug that I turned on? Effectively, there's a Spark session in the background we're using. Features like projection, which, not to go too deep into that, that's extremely helpful when you don't have a schema. You can actually kind of query that and bring a schema back. But also things like data preview, this is only available if you have this turned on. Now there's not much going on here. We're literally previewing the data. We did that in the data set. But the cool part is data preview is now going to be available for every single transform that we go through, right? Every single one. So we're going to be able to see what the efforts are of our transformations. So I'm going to let that bring that back. Let's go ahead and bring in our second source, product models. We have our data set for that. There we're having a tough time here. There we go. Boom. All right. If we wanted to, we could preview it, but that's going to be perfectly fine. All we need to do now is find a way to combine these, right? We've got 23 columns here. I got 2 columns in here. I can define a relationship between product model ID, wherever that one's hiding. There's a column in here. These are all of my columns. Pretty sure this is it right here. Product model ID, you can see some of them have a product model, some do not. Don't forget though that in our description we wanted to maintain all the products. We didn't want to lose any, even if they did not have any model description. So that's going to play a big role in what we're going to decide next, right? Very critical on what we make a choice here. It's actually just going to find those matches, so it's actually going to take advantage of that for us. So let's go ahead. There are other ways we could do that too. You could do a join here, right? A join would provide us what we're looking for. We could do a lookup here. A lookup is only going to do matches. And you know what? I'm going to change it. Let's actually go and show the lookup, right? We're going to do a lookup here. This is going to combine data sets. Basically, this is going to bring in and give me the models right in here. So the item in here, the setup here, right? What is the primary stream? Products all, okay. What is the lookup stream? What are we going to look up against? Product models. Notice how it kind of connects this now. And what do we want to do? You can match multiple rows. There's a lot of different options, but basically we need to say, okay, from the left table, from the products all table, what is the column that we're considering? What do we want to look for matches on? And there should be a product model ID. When that equals product model ID on the other table. So you can see both of those matching. Now there is something of question. If you notice too though, it tells me product model ID is a string data type. Product model ID is a string data type. That's interesting. I would have figured this is supposed to be numeric effectively. So here's a cool thing that we can do. When you're actually looking at these data sources, these are coming from delimited text. So one of the small setbacks is data types. The perfect thing is you can actually have it automatically detect data types for you. It samples the data, and this is also because of Dataflow debug, and it will bring back what it considers the right data types. But we can also make adjustments. Notice everything was string here. Things have been adjusted, right? One of the things we're definitely going to need to adjust, because we're going to mess with it here in a moment, you see weight. Weight is currently a string value. We're going to go ahead and switch this into an integer, right? So weight's an integer. You can see there's some date times down here, the cell start date, cell end date, discontinued date. I'm actually going to turn those into dates timestamps, if it lets me. All right. And you can see you can make these adjustments. I'm modifying this schema in line. Right? And let's make sure product model ID, technically these are going to be integer values. I'll leave it as is, but we have to make sure they're the same. So it's string here, it's definitely going to be string over here. Let's make sure it is. So making that adjustment, and here's the cool part, I can go ahead right now, notice it went from 23 columns to 25, it makes sense, 23 plus 2. If you're used to doing lookups in, let's say, SQL, you might be like, wait a second, you know, the product model ID, that was just something we used for the lookup. I don't need product model ID from, you know, I just need one product model ID, right? That was the whole point of it. And you'll notice, I mean, if we look right here, there's a product model ID, and then there's also a product model ID. So there's a bit of duplication, and also we see there's something just called name and name. That's going to be a little bit of an issue, but that's okay because we can fix this right now. We're going to adjust it. First off, we don't need the second product model ID coming from this table. We can get rid of it, right? I don't need that anymore. So I can go in here and say, you know what? I'm going to use this select transform, right? Choose columns to flow to the next stream. You could just literally select, you know, I'm getting 20, and notice it went straight down to 23. Why is that? Well, if I scroll down here and you notice, it's automatically skipping duplicate input and skipping duplicate output names, right? I'm going to say here, remove duplicates. That's what we're doing here, duplicate columns. And technically, I just need to go find one. Products all gives me the data set. Name is called name. If we scroll down though, here's products all product model ID. That'll stay. Notice down here, products models name. So this is the second name. That's okay. I'm going to update this. Instead of name, which is going to be super weird, I'm going to call it model name. And technically, you see this product model ID? Gone, out of there. So now we are down to 24 columns. I think technically we can kind of move this also. I can kind of move this up the line if I want this to be like a little bit closer up here. Product number. All right, so now we have name and model name, right? So preview this after getting rid of that extra column here. We're going to see that we have this all situated. Any moment, and you can see product name, model name. Now granted, some of these are missing model names. That's okay. We're about to kind of shorten up that list. We're going to go ahead and remove the items that have no list price, right? That was one of the criteria. So I'm going to go ahead and say remove no list price. So as you can imagine, we are once again modifying the schema here. Well, technically we're modifying the rows. So I need to go ahead and find the filter transform here. We'll kind of label it accordingly. We're going to call it remove, no list price, something like that, list price. Right? Get rid of anything that has no list price. And you'll see that the configuration for some of these, like this one in particular, all it does is say, open, you got to write an expression.
So this is where we're going to see that expression builder here, where we can say, hey, we want to go in and set this up so that we can see we can't preview this yet because we have to have an expression, but if we go back, we have a bunch of items that have 0. It's literally blanks for the list price. So I'm going to do, they're actually 0 values. We're going to go ahead and write an expression, and there are tons of expressions here, guys. If we go over to functions alone, I mean, just start scrolling. There is so much going in here. This is literally all of the functions. If you want to get into the aggregate realm, you can check for sum. You can see that there's like sum distinct, sum if, sum distinct if, any type of aggregation, sum, average, min, maxes. They're all going to be available here, and they have some great conditional logic that's baked into it, right? For us, we don't need to do a sum in this case. We literally want to test a column, and only rows that basically pass this test are going to go further on down the stream. So we literally would say, and in this case, we're going to use one here that simply is called not equals. And it kind of tells you comparison, not equals operator. The IntelliSense or the kind of sample text here, not the best, but we're going to say, hey, not equals. And what are we checking? Well, I want you to look in the column. We can go over here to schema, input schema. And I'm going to say, I want you to look in the list price column and where it does not equal 0. Those are the only ones that are going to pass here, right? So when I save and finish this, I can preview this. We're going to see we definitely have a significantly smaller set of records. I think we have, this one's actually not showcasing. Normally we get a total here. It's a little weird. But if I look at the preview here, if we go over to list price now, where are you hiding list price? My eyes may have deceived. There it is. We will have nothing here that is blank. This also shortened out we have a total of 304 records now. I think it's over 500 before, but you can see now you have much more model names since we got rid of that. There still are some blanks here for that, but that's okay. We didn't want to get rid of any products as long as they had a list price. Bring them back regardless if they have a model name or not. So really the only last thing to do here is to kind of write it to a destination, right? Once you've gone through, kind of set up all the logic that you like to do, then you can go over and choose the bottom option on the destination, which is your sync. And you could say, hey, we're going to write this to a file called products final, right? We actually didn't create a data set for this, but it's okay. We can do it on the fly here. And I can say, I want to go ahead and create a new data set. I'm going to write it to my data lake. I'll go ahead and keep it to a delimited text as we've been doing here. And we're going to go ahead and call this same thing, Azure ADLS underscore product final. Where do we want to write it? That location. I want to put the first row in headers. And where do we want to write this to? And I'm actually going to write this to the destination. Why not? Makes sense. And we can hit OK. I can take a look. I always like to open up my data sets as well and kind of look like what is going to be the name here. So I can go over, when we go over to the settings for this, file name option, default, we can put these options, we can put headers. There's a ton of different options. What I'm going to actually do is in this data set, I'm going to give it the name products final.csv. We're going to see here. We got all those options, it's set. So then this, I mean, we could preview it, but the preview is the same as the remove null price. The question really happens is, well, now that we've got this set, right? I've created the data flow, I added the 3 data sets to this, the 2 sources, the destinations. How do we actually run this, right? And this will be the last kind of main lesson of the day since we're getting close to that mark. The data flow debug obviously lets us preview a ton of very helpful things when we're developing a data flow. But we don't actually have an option within the UI here to just run this. The way that you would actually have to run this is through a pipeline, where I would say, okay, I'm done with this. Let me go ahead and turn off my data flow debug. Technically, there is a cost for having a debug session running. It defaults and times out after 1 hour of no activity to kind of protect you there. But I can say, okay, I want to end up running this. I can't do it through here. The way we can execute this is actually through a pipeline. So I could create a new pipeline. Let's just call this demo 6 execute data flow.
And you can see under move and transform, there's literally a data flow. So imagine all the previous demonstrations we've done with the get metadata, the lookups, the if conditions, the stored procedures. As part of that process, you can just run a data flow. That could be early on in the process, later on in the process, however you see fit. And all you need to do to configure this, I'll call this run, data flow demo. That's what it's called. And we simply just choose which data flow do I want to execute. And I only have the one. We do get to choose which integration runtime we'd like to leverage this. Within your IR choice, you get a list of whatever options you have available to you. So you can scale this up as part of this, but it all depends on what type of integration services you have set. So you might have to create a new one if you want to kind of scale this up. But this is how you would literally run this. Right? If I wanted at this moment, I could hit debug and it would execute this and I would end up with a file, right? I can go ahead and if I had to use a debug session, I'm gonna let this just kind of run in the background, but how would I do this in an unattended manner, right? Obviously I'm here, I was able to run those pipelines, I'm now technically running this data flow. What about scheduling, right? It was asked early on. And there's quite a few choices in here, but the scheduling option, as far as what's organic to us, built into the UI, has been in front of us the whole time. It is right here, and it's called a trigger. When you go, and you can actually technically create triggers from the pipeline user interface like you see here, or you can actually go to the Manage Hub. But when you hit Add Trigger, you can see there's an option here for New and Edit. If I had triggers, they would show up, but I can hit a new one. And triggers have varying choices. This is literally the very typical schedule. I want this to start at this time frame. Notice it's based off of UTC, but I can adjust this. I can say I want this to start at Eastern time. I want this to occur, and you choose your cadence. Let's say I wanted this pipeline, which is going to run this data flow to happen every Tuesday and Thursday. I could say, hey, I want to do the cadence of a week. I'm going to run it every 1 week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, let's say at 7 p.m. So I would do 1900. By setting this, I literally create a schedule that this pipeline is tied to, and it will run unattended in this time frame. But that's not the only option. You technically have 3 other choices to schedule from. You have tumbling windows, which only gives you the cadence of the minute and hour. So you're doing this within multiple tumbling windows within a day, basically. But this can be great for restartability. You have storage events, which actually relates specifically to blob storage accounts. Technically, that's what we've been using. So you can say, hey, if a folder or a file is created and or deleted, that's my condition, then I want this pipeline to trigger. Kind of cool. And then lastly, the newest kid on the block is custom events. But custom events is something that you actually have to leave Azure Data Factory. You actually have to go into what's called Azure Event Grid. You have to go to that service, create what are called topics, and once those topics are created, you can effectively create basically event-based triggers almost around anything in Azure. It's actually super cool, but that's its own learning curve. You got to learn how to write topics, but once you've done that, you can tie it in and leverage it right here. So a pretty interesting kind of thing. Like I said, it's the newest one available. Pretty cool. That's one I'm trying to get more into because it's pretty interesting. But something that should be noted, like I said, if I wanted to, I could hit OK, and technically now I have a trigger set. It's going to run this. Also, kind of on the side note here, let me go over to my destination. Actually, something might have publishing. So eventually, right, this would, hasn't run yet. Thought I'd kick that off. Maybe it's still kind of prepping. I'll let that go in the background. But basically, you can set these triggers as you see fit. And just for the peace of mind, guys, you can also do other external ways of kicking this off. In our YouTube channel, you actually have the capability of seeing some recordings that Mitchell actually did. And what it is of showing using Logic Apps to kick off an Azure Data Factory. You can actually also do it with Power Automate. So, let me bring this in. Hopefully this doesn't have too bad of an impact. I know it kind of made the session choppy before, so hopefully this doesn't do anything too crazy. But we're right at the mark. We're right at 2 o'clock. Sorry for that delayed beginning, guys. That lost us about 20 minutes for more questions and conversation, but You guys have been chatting it up, and you've been keeping Mitchell busy, busy, busy. So hopefully that's been extremely beneficial and helpful. What we do is we kind of gather up after this session. We look at some of those questions that maybe we weren't able to answer due to the depth of it. We will look and see at, what other options, like what other kind of conversational rabbit holes we can go down. And generally we'll have just a general video posted on YouTube kind of responding to questions of this. So you definitely want to keep your eye out for that. Usually it takes a little bit of time to gather all the info and prepare and record the video. But as a follow-up to this, if you're looking for a little item, keep an eye out for that. There will be a follow-up of the kind of Q&As. We'll present the question, and we'll showcase and we'll talk about the answer together. Don't forget, though, this session itself is being recorded. You can rewind and watch it as you see fit. And don't forget also, in the description, that's where you find the resources and the certificate of completion. So, yeah, my goodness, 3 hours goes by super quickly. This is just the very beginnings. And if you just go into that YouTube channel, you're going to see quite a few videos that we have done already in there around various aspects that we've already talked about here, but also more advanced ones in the realm of Azure Data Factory. And if you do take advantage of that sale that we have today for on-demand learning, you've got, I want to say it's like 7 hours and 8 hours respectively. So roughly around 15 hours of content for intro and advanced Azure Data Factory stuff. We have stuff in the realm of Synapse. I saw questions around Spark, questions around Data Lake. It's all on there, guys. Definitely check it out. Thank you guys for joining me today. I appreciate